This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was 12 years old that summer, excited for my first time at sleepaway camp. My parents thought it would be good for me to spend some time in nature, make new friends, learn some independence. If only they had known what horrors awaited me there. The first few days were pretty normal, canoeing on the lake, roasting marshmallows, telling ghost stories around the campfire. But there was always something off about the place. The counselors seemed on edge, exchanging worried glances when they thought we weren't looking. And at night, when the woods grew dark and still, you could hear things moving out there. Unnatural things. It was on the fourth night that everything went to hell. I woke up to screams coming from the girls' cabins across the way. Heart pounding, I scrambled out of my bunk to see what was happening. That's when I saw it, a massive, shadowy figure prowling between the cabins. It moved in a way that was just wrong, like its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. I'll never forget the moment it turned and looked right at me with glowing red eyes. Pure evil radiated from that thing. I was frozen in terror as it started loping towards our cabin. Just then my friend Todd grabbed me and yanked me back inside, slamming the door shut. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, shaking uncontrollably. Todd's face was pale as a ghost. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here, now." We woke the other boys and tried to sneak out the back, but the creature was circling the cabin. We could hear its heavy breathing, the scrape of claws on wood. For hours we huddled in terror, praying for morning to come. When the sun finally rose, the thing was gone. But so were half the campers and counselors. There was blood everywhere, drag marks leading into the woods, torn clothing scattered on the ground. It was a scene of absolute carnage. The next few days were a blur of police, search parties, and hysterical parents. They never found any bodies. The official story was that it must have been a bear attack. But we knew the truth. We had seen that thing with our own eyes, and it was no bear. In the years that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Nightmares plagued me constantly. I couldn't sleep with the lights off. Any unexplained sound would send me into a panic attack. My parents didn't know how to help me. They hadn't been there. They couldn't understand the horror of what we'd witnessed. It was during my therapy sessions that I first became interested in psychology. I was fascinated by how the human mind copes with trauma, how it tries to make sense of the senseless. As I got older, I knew I wanted to dedicate my life to helping other kids who had been through traumatic experiences. I threw myself into my studies, eventually earning my PhD in child psychology. My own experiences gave me a unique perspective and ability to connect with young trauma survivors. I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear I had lived with for so long, and I knew how to help them start to heal. But even as I built my career and tried to move on with my life, I could never fully shake the memories of that night, the knowledge that true evil exists in this world, that nightmares can become reality. It changes you forever. I became obsessed with researching folklore, paranormal phenomena, anything that might explain what we encountered at Camp Willow Creek. Todd and I stayed in touch over the years, bonded by our shared trauma. We made a pact to stay vigilant, to watch for any signs that the creature might return. Every few months we'd touch base, sharing any weird news stories or unexplained disappearances that caught our attention. It was during one of these check-ins, about 5 years ago, that Todd dropped a bombshell on me. "Rob," he said, his voice tight with barely contained panic, "I think it's back." My blood ran cold. What do you mean? Where? There have been a string of disappearances in the mountains about 50 miles from the old camp. Hikers, campers, just vanishing without a trace. And get this, witnesses reported seeing a large, dark figure moving through the trees at night. Red eyes. I felt like I was going to be sick. All these years, I had hoped and prayed that it was over, that the nightmare was behind us. But deep down, I think I always knew this day would come. What do we do? I asked, already knowing the answer. We have to go back, Todd said grimly. We have to stop it. And so, 20 years after that fateful summer, I found myself driving back to the place that had haunted my dreams for so long. Todd and I had done our research, gathered supplies, silver bullets, holy water, anything we thought might help. But the truth was, we had no idea what we were up against or how to fight it. As we hiked into the dense forest, every snapping twig and rustling leaf set my nerves on edge. The old fear came flooding back, threatening to overwhelm me. But I pushed it down, reminding myself that I wasn't that helpless kid anymore. We had a job to do. For days we searched, following tracks and investigating abandoned campsites. And then, on the fourth night, just like before, we heard the screams. Heart pounding, we raced towards the sound. And there it was, exactly as I remembered. A massive, writhing shadow with gleaming red eyes. It had a young woman in its grasp, ready to drag her off into the darkness. Without thinking, I charged forward, firing my gun and yelling at the top of my lungs. The silver bullets seemed to hurt it. It let out an unearthly shriek and dropped the woman. Todd rushed in to pull her to safety while I kept firing, driving the creature back. For a moment, I thought we had won, but then it reared up to its full height, easily 10 feet tall, and let out a bone-chilling roar. I knew in that instant that our weapons were useless. This thing, whatever it was beyond our comprehension. Just as I was sure we were done for, a blinding light erupted from the trees behind us. The creature recoiled, shrieking in agony. I turned to see an old man emerge from the forest, holding some kind of glowing artifact. "Run!" he shouted. "I can hold it off, but not for long." We didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing the terrified woman, we sprinted back the way we had come. Behind us, we could hear the sounds of an otherworldly battle raging. We didn't stop running until we reached the ranger station at the edge of the park. The woman was hysterical, babbling about a monster in the woods. The rangers clearly thought we were all crazy or on drugs. But I didn't care. We were alive. Todd and I never saw the old man again. We went back the next day with a search party, but there was no sign of him or the creature, just some scorched earth and claw marks on the trees. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened out there. Was the old man some kind of guardian, sworn to keep the creature at bay? Had he finally managed to banish it for good? Or was it just biding its time, waiting to emerge again? All I know is that the experience reaffirmed my life's mission. There is evil in this world, real, tangible evil that most people can't even imagine. And there are kids out there who have seen it, who have to live with that knowledge every day. My job, my purpose, is to help those kids, to let them know they're not crazy, that what they experienced was real, and to teach them how to live with the trauma, how to find strength in survival. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still flinch at unexplained noises in the dark. But I'm not that scared little boy anymore. I'm a survivor, a protector, and as long as I'm breathing, I'll keep fighting to keep other kids safe from the monsters, both human and inhuman, that lurk in the shadows. The horror I experienced at Camp Willow Creek will always be a part of me. But I've learned to use it as fuel, to turn my pain into purpose. Because in the end, That's the only way to truly conquer our demons, to face them head on and use what they taught us to make the world a little bit safer, a little bit brighter. And who knows, maybe someday I'll encounter that old man again, or uncover the true nature of the creature that haunted those woods. But until then, I'll keep doing what I do best, helping kids face their fears and reclaim their lives from the darkness that threatens to consume them. Because in the end, that's the greatest victory of all. I was always skeptical of my dad's stories about the strange things he'd seen in the woods. Growing up, I'd roll my eyes whenever he'd start in on one of his tall tales around the campfire. Monsters lurking in the shadows, inexplicable lights in the sky, eerie sounds echoing through the trees. It all seemed like the kind of spooky folklore you'd expect from a lifelong hunter and outdoorsman. But after what happened last week, I'm not so sure anymore. Now those old stories are rattling around in my head, taking on a new and terrifying significance. I can't stop thinking about the warnings my dad tried to pass down, the things he wanted me to be prepared for. If only I'd listened. It was supposed to be a routine camping trip, just me and my buddy Michael heading out to Blackwood Forest for a long weekend of hiking and fishing. We've been going up there for years, ever since we were kids. I know those trails like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. The first day went smoothly enough. We hiked a few miles in, set up camp near the river, caught some trout for dinner. As night fell, we built up the fire and cracked open a couple beers, swapping stories and cracking jokes like always. But there was an odd tension in the air, a stillness that felt unnatural. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was oddly muted. Even the wind seemed to have died down to nothing more than an occasional whisper through the pines. "You feel that?" Michael asked, glancing around uneasily. I nodded, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "Probably just a storm rolling in or something," I said with forced nonchalance. But I couldn't quite convince myself. There wasn't a cloud in the star-filled sky. As the night wore on, the silence only grew deeper. We turned in early, both of us on edge but reluctant to admit it. I tossed and turned for hours, straining my ears for any sound beyond our own breathing. Just as I was finally drifting off, a blood-curdling shriek split the night. I bolted upright, heart pounding. "Michael, you hear that?" I hissed. "Yeah," he whispered back. "What the hell was it?" "Probably just a fox or something," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. But we both knew that wasn't true. This sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, raw and feral and somehow wrong. We sat in tense silence for what felt like hours, ears straining for any further noise. Just as I was starting to think we'd imagined it, another scream ripped through the darkness, closer this time, much closer. "We need to get out of here," Michael said, already scrambling for his boots. I didn't argue. We grabbed our packs and flashlights, not bothering with the rest of our gear. The warm glow of the dying campfire did little to penetrate the pitch black of the forest as we stumbled onto the trail, guided only by the narrow beams of our lights. That's when I saw it, just for a split second, illuminated in the sweep of my flashlight, a towering figure at the edge of the clearing. It was vaguely humanoid, but grotesquely elongated, with limbs like gnarled tree branches. And its face. God, its face. Hollow eye sockets and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth, stretched in a rictus grin that was almost worse than the screams. I froze, rooted to the spot in terror. Michael grabbed my arm, yanking me forward. "Run!" he yelled. We tore down the trail, branches whipping at our faces as we careened through the underbrush. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind us, moving far faster than anything that size should be able to. The screams were constant now, a hellish cacophony that seemed to be coming from all around us. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in that mad dash through the dark. My lungs were burning, legs trembling with exhaustion, but sheer adrenaline kept me going. We burst out of the tree line onto the access road where we'd left the car, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the doors. As we peeled out onto the main road, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the forest, I swear I saw multiple sets of glowing eyes watching us go. We drove in stunned silence for miles, both of us trying to process what we'd just experienced. It wasn't until we hit the outskirts of town that Michael finally spoke. "What? What was that thing?" he asked, voice hoarse. I shook my head, mind reeling. "I don't know, but I think my dad might." As soon as we got back to civilization, I called my father. His gruff voice, usually so steady and sure, trembled slightly as I recounted our experience. "I was afraid this might happen someday," he said quietly. I hoped you'd never have to face it yourself." "Face what, Dad?" I demanded. "What the hell was that thing?" He sighed heavily. "We don't have a name for it, not really. The old-timers used to call it the Wendigo, but that's not quite right. It's something older, something that's been in these woods a lot longer than us." As he spoke, memories of all those campfire stories came flooding back. The tales I'd dismissed as fantasy suddenly took on a chilling new light. My great-grandfather's account of being stalked through the forest by something he couldn't quite describe. The time my uncle swore he saw a creature with glowing eyes and impossibly long limbs watching him from the trees. "Why didn't you ever tell me it was real?" I asked, a mix of anger and fear churning in my gut. "Would you have believed me?" he countered. "Hell, I barely believed it myself for the longest time. It's not the kind of thing you can really prepare someone for, but I tried, in my own way. All those warnings about staying on the trails, never going too deep into the backcountry alone, I hoped it would be enough." We talked for hours, my dad filling in the gaps of a family history I'd never fully understood. Generations of hunters and trappers who'd passed down knowledge of the forest's dangers in hushed tones and oblique warnings. A legacy of encounters with things that defied explanation, preserved through folklore and fireside tales. "It's not just our family," he explained. "A lot of the old families around here have similar stories. It's why some of those areas deep in the forest have stayed untouched for so long. People know, even if they don't want to admit it. There are things out there best left alone." In the days since, I've pored over old family journals and local histories, piecing together a picture of something far stranger and more terrifying than I ever imagined. The creature we encountered wasn't an isolated incident. It, or others like it, have been a part of this region's history for centuries. I can't stop thinking about how close we came to becoming just another mysterious disappearance, another tragic footnote in the forest's long and bloody history. And I can't shake the feeling that our encounter was just the beginning of something larger. Those eyes I saw watching us leave. I don't think we've seen the last of whatever's out there. And next time, I intend to be prepared. I'm going back up to my dad's place next week to learn everything he knows. If this is part of our family's legacy, then I need to understand it. Because one thing's for certain, I'll never look at those woods the same way again, and I'll never again dismiss the old stories as mere tall tales. Sometimes the monsters are all too real. We had just moved into this beautiful old Victorian home in a quiet neighborhood. It was a dream come true. Spacious rooms for the kids, a big backyard, and so much character. As a pediatric nurse, I was thrilled to have a cozy home to come back to after long shifts at the hospital. The first few nights were uneventful. We were all exhausted from unpacking and settling in. But on that fourth night, I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. At first, I thought it was just my body clock adjusting to the new environment, but then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere in the house. I nudged James awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He groggily sat up, listening intently. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. "It's probably just mice," I reasoned, trying to calm my racing heart. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal rodent behavior. The sound had an eerie, almost deliberate quality to it. James got up to investigate, and I followed close behind. As we stepped into the hallway, the temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath in front of me, which made no sense given it was the middle of summer. The scratching intensified as we approached our daughter Emma's room. My maternal instincts kicked into overdrive. I rushed forward, pushing past James to open her door. The sight that greeted us will haunt me for the rest of my life. Emma was floating several feet above her bed, her small body rigid and her eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. The scratching sound was deafening now, seeming to come from every direction at once. I screamed, breaking whatever spell had taken hold. Emma dropped back onto her bed with a thud, instantly awake and crying. I ran to her, scooping her up in my arms, my nurse training kicking in as I checked her for any injuries. James was frozen in shock, but I barked at him to get our son, Michael, from his room. We needed to get out of the house now. As we hurried down the stairs, family photos began flying off the walls, crashing around us. The front door slammed shut on its own, and no matter how hard James pulled, it wouldn't budge. I clutched Emma tightly, my mind racing through possible explanations, but coming up empty. This defied everything I knew about the physical world. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this couldn't be happening, but the evidence was undeniable. We huddled together in the living room, the children crying and James looking utterly lost. I knew I had to stay calm for their sake. Years of dealing with medical emergencies had taught me the importance of keeping a level head in crisis situations. "We need to stick together," I said firmly, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "Whatever this is, we're stronger as a family." Just then, an unearthly howl echoed through the house, and the lights began to flicker wildly. I saw a dark shape move in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Emma whimpered, burying her face in my chest. "Mommy, the bad thing is here," she whispered. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What bad thing, sweetie?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The shadow man," she replied, her voice muffled against my shirt. "He's been watching me sleep." I exchanged a horrified glance with James. How long had this been going on without us noticing? Suddenly, Michael let out a blood-curdling scream. We turned to see him pointing at the ceiling, his face pale with terror. Following his gaze, I saw what looked like words being carved into the plaster. "Get out." That was enough for James. He grabbed a heavy lamp and smashed it through the nearest window. The sound of breaking glass seemed to trigger a frenzy of activity in the house. Objects began flying around the room, narrowly missing us as we scrambled towards the broken window. I pushed Emma through first, then helped Michael. James lifted me through, and I turned to pull him out. Just as he was climbing through, something grabbed his leg, trying to drag him back inside. I held onto his arms, refusing to let go, screaming for him to fight it. With a final burst of strength, James kicked free and tumbled out onto the lawn. We ran to the car, not even bothering to grab shoes or keys. James hot-wired it, a skill I didn't know he had and didn't want to question at that moment, and we sped away from the house. As we drove, I turned to look back. What I saw made my blood run cold. A dark, humanoid figure stood in the broken window, watching us leave. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. We drove for hours, eventually stopping at a 24-hour diner when the sun came up. As we sat there, shell-shocked and trying to process what had happened, I realized how unprepared we were for something like this. My medical training, James's business acumen, none of it mattered in the face of whatever we had encountered. I looked at my family, James still visibly shaken, the kids exhausted and scared. I knew then that my role had to be the anchor, the voice of reason and strength. We couldn't go back to that house, but we couldn't run forever either. "We need a plan," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "We need to figure out what that thing was and how to protect ourselves." James nodded, squeezing my hand. "You're right. We're in this together." As I sat there in that dingy diner, surrounded by my traumatized family, I realized our lives had irrevocably changed. The world was bigger and scarier than I had ever imagined, but we had each other, and for now, that had to be enough. In the days that followed, we stayed with my sister, trying to make sense of what had happened. I threw myself into research, looking into the history of our house and similar supernatural encounters. James focused on finding us a new place to live, somewhere far away from that cursed Victorian. The kids were struggling to cope. Emma had nightmares every night, crying out about the shadow man. Michael became withdrawn, jumping at every little sound. I arranged for them to see a child psychologist. But how do you explain to a mental health professional that your children are traumatized by a genuine supernatural encounter? I found myself constantly on edge, scrutinizing every shadow, every unexpected sound. My colleagues at the hospital noticed the change in me. How could I explain that my worldview had been shattered in a single night? As the days turned into weeks, we slowly began to rebuild our lives. We found a new house, went through the motions of moving again, and tried to establish a new normal. But the memory of that night lingered, a constant reminder that the world was not as we had once believed it to be. I often caught James staring off into space, a troubled look on his face. One night, after the kids were in bed, he confessed that he felt guilty for not protecting us better. I reminded him that we had all made it out alive, thanks in no small part to his quick thinking. "We're a team," I told him, squeezing his hand. "We face that thing together, and we'll face whatever comes next together too." As time passed, the acute fear began to fade, replaced by a persistent unease. We installed security cameras in our new home. Not that they would do much good against a supernatural threat. I found myself checking on the kids multiple times each night, terrified of finding them floating above their beds again. Emma slowly opened up about her experiences, revealing that she had seen the shadow man several times before that fateful night. The guilt I felt for not noticing sooner was overwhelming. As a nurse, I was trained to pick up on signs of distress in children. How had I missed this? We decided not to tell anyone else about what had happened. Who would believe us? Instead, we focused on healing as a family. We started seeing a therapist together, framing our experience as a traumatic break-in to avoid sounding crazy. It wasn't the whole truth, but it allowed us to process some of our feelings. Months after the incident, I woke up one night to find Emma standing by our bed, her eyes wide with fear. "He's here, Mommy," she whispered. "The shadow man found us." My heart raced as I scanned the room, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. But Emma was insistent, pointing to a dark corner. And then, for just a moment, I saw it too. A shifting darkness, deeper than the surrounding shadows, with pinpricks of light where eyes should be. I blinked, and it was gone. But the chill that ran down my spine was all too real. Whatever had been in our old house hadn't stayed there. It had followed us. That night, as I held Emma close, trying to soothe her back to sleep, I made a silent vow. I would protect my family from this thing, whatever it took. I didn't know how to fight a supernatural entity, but I would learn. We had survived once, and we would survive again. As I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of my family sleeping, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. That night in the Victorian house wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning. Whatever this shadow man was, whatever it wanted, we would face it together. Because in the end, our love for each other was the strongest weapon we had against the darkness that threatened to engulf us. I remember that day like it was yesterday, even though I was only 10 years old at the time. It was a crisp autumn morning, and I woke up feeling uneasy for some reason. Something just felt off. I tried to shake the feeling as I got ready for school, but it lingered like a bad smell. As I ate breakfast with my parents and younger sister, I noticed Dad seemed distracted. He kept glancing out the window with a worried look on his face. When I asked him what was wrong, he just smiled and said everything was fine. But I could tell he was lying. At school, I couldn't focus on my lessons. That nagging feeling of dread kept growing stronger as the day went on. During recess, I stood alone by the fence, staring at the woods beyond the playground. The trees seemed to sway unnaturally, even though there was no wind. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the strange movement continued. When the final bell rang, I practically ran out of the building. I wanted to get home as fast as possible, though I couldn't explain why. As I hurried down our street, I noticed how quiet everything was. No birds chirping, no dogs barking. Even the usual after-school chatter of kids playing outside was absent. I burst through our front door, calling out for Mom and Dad. No answer. The house felt empty and cold. I checked every room, my heart pounding. Where were they? They should have been home by now. Just as panic started to set in, I heard the back door open. Relief flooded through me as I ran to greet my parents. But the feeling was short-lived. One look at their faces told me something was very wrong. Dad's eyes were wide with fear, and Mom was trembling. They ushered me and my sister into the living room, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Dad told us to stay put while he went to check on something outside. Mom held us close, trying to calm us down, but I could feel her shaking. We waited for what felt like hours, though it was probably only about 20 minutes. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It sounded like it came from old Mrs. Johnson's house next door. Mom jumped up and ran to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek out. I'll never forget the look of horror on her face. She stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp in the process. "James!" she yelled for my dad. "James, get back in here now." Dad came running back inside, slamming and locking the door behind him. He was out of breath and pale as a ghost. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "Now." As we scrambled to grab a few essentials, I heard a low, rumbling sound outside. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a growl, not quite a roar. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We piled into the car, and Dad peeled out of the driveway so fast I thought the tires might catch fire. As we sped down the street, I turned to look out the back window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A dark, shapeless mass was moving through our neighborhood. It wasn't quite solid, more like a dense fog, but it moved with purpose. As it passed each house, the lights inside would flicker and go out, and then silence. No screams, no sounds of panic, just an eerie, oppressive silence. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. As we turned the corner, I saw the mass engulf Mrs. Johnson's house. For a split second, I thought I saw faces pressing against the windows, terrified, pleading faces. And then they were gone, swallowed up by the darkness. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were several towns away. We ended up staying at a small motel for a few days, glued to the TV for any news about what had happened. But there was nothing. It was like our entire neighborhood had simply ceased to exist. When we finally returned home nearly a week later, everything looked normal. Houses intact, lawns mowed, cars in driveways. But there wasn't a single person in sight. Every home was empty, as if the occupants had simply vanished into thin air. The police investigated, of course. They searched every house, every inch of the surrounding woods, but they found nothing. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no clues whatsoever. It was as if over 200 people had just disappeared. In the years since, I've tried to make sense of what happened that day. I've researched similar incidents, talked to experts in various fields, but nothing comes close to explaining what we experienced. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that low, rumbling sound in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, half expecting to see that dark mass outside my window. But it's never there, just the normal, quiet night. I don't know if we'll ever understand what happened in our neighborhood that day. Part of me hopes we do, so we can finally have some closure. But another part of me is terrified of knowing the truth. Because if something like that exists in our world, what else might be out there, lurking in the shadows? All I know for sure is that something changed in me that day. I became more aware, more attuned to the world around me. I notice things now that others seem to miss. Subtle shifts in energy, unexplained sounds, fleeting shadows in the corner of my eye. I've tried talking to my parents about it over the years, but they always change the subject. I think the experience was too traumatic for them to revisit, but I can't let it go. I need to understand. That's why I'm sharing my story here. I'm hoping that someone, somewhere, might have experienced something similar. Or maybe someone out there has some insight into what that dark mass could have been. I know it sounds crazy. Trust me, I've questioned my own sanity more times than I can count. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it was real, and it's still out there somewhere. So if you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, or if you have any information that might help me make sense of what happened, please reach out, because until I understand what happened that day, I'll never truly feel safe. And to anyone who might be skeptical, all I can say is this: cherish your loved ones. Hold them close, because you never know when something might come along and snatch them away in the blink of an eye. As for me, I'll keep searching for answers, because I owe it to Mrs. Johnson, to all our neighbors who vanished that day, and to that scared 10-year-old boy who saw something he wasn't supposed to see. We all deserve to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. It was just another ordinary evening at first. My husband Tom was working late, so I was home alone with our 5-year-old daughter Emma. We had our usual bedtime routine, dinner, bath, story time, then tucking her in around 8:30. Emma fell asleep quickly, and I settled in on the couch to watch some TV before heading to bed myself. Around 10 p.m., I heard Emma's bedroom door creak open. Figuring she'd woken up and needed something, I called out, "Emma, sweetie, everything okay?" There was no response, just the soft padding of little feet in the hallway. I muted the TV and listened, waiting for her to appear in the living room doorway. But the footsteps stopped abruptly. "Emma," I called again, a bit louder this time. Still nothing. Slightly concerned, I got up to check on her. As I rounded the corner into the hallway, my blood ran cold. Emma was standing there motionless, facing the wall, her back to me. But something was off. Her nightgown looked different, an old-fashioned style I'd never seen before, and her hair seemed longer, falling in messy tangles down her back. "Honey," I said hesitantly, "what are you doing out here? Let's get you back to bed." I reached out to touch her shoulder, but before I could, she slowly turned her head to look at me. I stumbled backwards with a choked gasp. It wasn't Emma. The face staring back at me was grotesquely distorted, too pale, eyes too large and dark, mouth stretched in an unnatural grin. It looked like a nightmarish caricature of my daughter. I blinked hard, convinced I must be seeing things. But when I opened my eyes, the entity was still there, grinning at me. It took a jerky step in my direction. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for Emma's room, desperate to check on my real daughter. I slammed the door behind me, fumbling for the light switch with shaking hands. Relief flooded through me when I saw Emma sleeping peacefully in her bed, exactly where I'd left her earlier. But that relief was short-lived as I realized the implications. If Emma was here, then what the hell was that thing in the hallway? As if in answer to my unspoken question, there was a light tapping on the bedroom door. Tap, tap, tap. My heart nearly stopped. Moving as quietly as I could, I scooped Emma up into my arms. She stirred and mumbled sleepily, "Mommy, what's wrong?" "Shh. It's okay, baby," I whispered, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "We're just going to play a little game. We need to be very quiet, okay?" She nodded, still groggy and confused. I carried her to the closet and set her down inside. "Stay here and don't make a sound. It's like hide and seek. I'll come get you when it's safe." Emma's eyes were wide now, picking up on my fear. "Mommy, I'm scared," she whimpered. "I know, sweetie, but it'll be okay. Just stay very quiet for me. I love you." I kissed her forehead and shut the closet door, praying she'd stay put and silent. The tapping on the bedroom door grew more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I looked around frantically for something to use as a weapon, grabbing a heavy trophy from Emma's bookshelf. Gripping it tightly, I approached the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob as I tried to steady my breathing. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. An eerie silence fell over the room. I stood frozen, straining to hear any sound from the hallway. Minutes ticked by with nothing. Had it left? I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or even more terrified. Just as I started to relax slightly, a new sound made my skin crawl, the slow turning of the doorknob. I stumbled backwards, raising the trophy defensively. The door swung open to reveal nothing. The hallway beyond was empty and dark. I edged forward cautiously, peering out into the shadows. No sign of the entity. Keeping my back to the wall, I inched down the hall, checking each room. Everything seemed normal. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I losing my mind? I was almost convinced I'd had some sort of stress-induced hallucination when I reached the kitchen. There on the floor was a set of small, wet footprints leading from the back door. My stomach dropped as I followed them with my eyes. They went straight to Emma's room. Panic seized me again as I raced back down the hall. "Emma!" I cried, flinging open the closet door. To my immense relief, she was still there, curled up and trembling. I gathered her in my arms, sobbing. "It's okay, baby, I've got you. You're safe now." As I held her close, trying to calm both of our racing hearts, Emma's small voice piped up, "Mommy, why was the other me so scary?" I froze. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Emma looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. I saw her. She looked like me, but wrong. She wanted me to go with her, but I was too scared. A chill ran down my spine. "When did you see her, Emma?" "Just now. She opened the closet door and tried to get me to come out, but then she heard you coming and disappeared." I felt sick. The thing had been in here with my daughter while I was out in the hall, and I'd never even seen or heard it. "What exactly did she say to you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Emma's brow furrowed as she concentrated. She said she was the real me, that I was just a copy, and I needed to go away so she could have her life back. She said if I didn't go with her, bad things would happen. Emma started crying again. "Mommy, I don't want to go away. I don't want the scary me to take my place." I hugged her fiercely. "Listen to me, Emma. You are the real you. That other thing is lying. It's trying to trick you, but I would never ever let anything take you away from me. Do you understand?" She nodded, sniffling. "You're safe now. It's gone." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. What if it came back? What if next time I couldn't protect her? I called Tom and told him he needed to come home immediately. I kept the explanation vague. I didn't want to freak him out while he was driving. While I waited for him to arrive, I packed a bag for Emma and myself. There was no way we were staying in this house tonight. We ended up checking into a hotel for the next few days, while Tom and I tried to figure out what to do. I was terrified to go back to the house, but we couldn't stay away forever. We had a priest come bless the house, installed security cameras, even had a psychic do a cleansing. Nothing seemed amiss after that, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of dread every time I walked down that hallway. It's been almost a month now, and we haven't had any more incidents. But I'm constantly on edge, watching Emma like a hawk for any sign that she's not herself. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of tapping coming from her closet. Tap, tap, tap. I don't know what that thing was or what it wanted with my daughter. All I know is that I'll do whatever it takes to keep Emma safe. But I can't help wondering, how do you protect your child from something that can wear her face? As I began digging through old property records and newspaper archives, I quickly realized there was more to the camp's origins than the cheerful story of summer fun we'd all grown up hearing. The land where Camp Willow Creek sits had been at the center of a bitter dispute dating back to the late 1800s. The official records showed that the camp was founded in 1923 by the Wilkinson family, wealthy industrialists from the city who wanted to create a rustic getaway for urban youth. But as I kept digging, I found references to another family who had laid claim to that same parcel of land decades earlier, the Burkes. The Burkes were a rough bunch with a reputation for violence. They'd settled in the area not long after the Civil War, carving out a hard-scrabble existence in the remote hills. According to local lore, they were moonshiners and poachers who didn't take kindly to outsiders. I managed to track down some living descendants of the Burke family, though most had long since left the area. After weeks of coaxing, I finally got one elderly woman to speak with me. What she told me sent chills down my spine. "That land was ours," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My great-granddaddy, he found it first, built a cabin there with his own 2 hands, But then them city folk came with their fancy papers, said it was theirs now. My people, we didn't read so good back then, didn't know nothing 'bout deeds and such. She went on to describe how the Wilkinsons had used their wealth and connections to manipulate local officials, essentially stealing the land out from under the Burkes. But the Burkes didn't go quietly. There was blood spilled, the old woman told me, her eyes distant. My granddaddy, he went up there with his brothers one night, said they was going to teach them Wilkinson boys a lesson. Don't rightly know what all happened, but granddaddy came back alone, covered in blood, never spoke of it again. This revelation sent me back to the archives with renewed fervor. Sure enough, buried in the back pages of a yellowed newspaper, I found a small item about 3 unidentified bodies discovered in the woods near the future campsite in the spring of 1922. The deaths were ruled accidental, but the article noted that the bodies showed signs of violence. As I continued to unravel this twisted history, more disturbing details emerged. The Wilkinsons had brought in workers from out of state to clear the land and build the camp, but the project was plagued by accidents and unexplained setbacks. Several workers quit, claiming they'd seen ghostly figures in the woods or heard unearthly screams in the night. Even after the camp opened, strange occurrences continued. Counselors reported items going missing or being moved. Some campers refused to sleep in certain cabins, saying they felt an oppressive presence. There were whispers of shadowy figures seen at the edge of the woods, always watching. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the land itself was somehow tainted by the violence and injustice of its past. It was as if the very soil remembered the blood that had been spilled, the lives that had been destroyed. I presented my findings to the town council, thinking they would want to know the truth about our local landmark. Their reaction shocked me. They listened in stony silence. Then the mayor cleared his throat and said, "Thank you for your thorough research, Maria. But I think we'll be sticking with the official history for the centennial. No need to dig up old ghosts, so to speak." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were going to sweep this all under the rug, pretend none of it had happened. But I couldn't let it go. I felt a responsibility to the truth, to the forgotten voices of the past. That night, I decided to visit Camp Willow Creek myself. I knew it was closed for the season, but I had to see it with my own eyes, now that I knew its true history. As I drove up the winding road through the dark woods, a sense of foreboding settled over me. The empty camp was eerie in the moonlight. Shadows seemed to shift and move of their own accord. As I walked among the silent cabins, I could almost hear echoes of laughter, of screams, of lives long past. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, at the edge of the clearing, I saw a figure. It was too dark to make out details, but something about its stance, its presence, filled me with an instinctive dread. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. When I managed to switch it on and point it towards the trees, the figure was gone. But I could have sworn I heard a whisper on the wind, "This land is ours." I ran back to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I sped away from the camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. For days afterward, I felt watched, even in my own home. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. I'd wake up in the night to the sound of footsteps, only to find the house empty. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the dark history I'd uncovered get to me. But deep down, I knew better. The land remembered. The past wasn't dead. It was very much alive, and it was angry. I've since left that town, unable to bear the weight of the secret I'd uncovered. but I can't escape the feeling that by digging into the past, I've somehow awakened something that was better left dormant. Sometimes late at night, I still hear those whispers on the wind, and I wonder, what other dark secrets lie buried in the soil of our seemingly peaceful towns? What other injustices cry out for recognition, for vengeance? I don't have answers, only a warning. Be careful when you dig into the past. You never know what ghosts you might unearth. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just the four of us heading up to the mountains for some hiking and stargazing. Travis and his buddies Mike and Chris were all experienced campers, so I felt safe enough tagging along despite my lack of outdoor skills. We drove up early Friday morning, the guys chatting excitedly about the trails they wanted to explore, while I tried to quell the nervous butterflies in my stomach. The first day went smoothly enough. We set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the earthy scent of leaves and pine needles. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we gathered around the campfire to roast hot dogs and marshmallows. The guys swapped stories and jokes, while I mostly listened, still feeling a bit out of my element, but enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. It wasn't until later that night that things took a turn for the bizarre. We had all turned in fairly early, exhausted from the day's hike. I was drifting off to sleep in our tent when a blood-curdling shriek pierced the quiet night air. I bolted upright, heart pounding. "Travis, did you hear that?" I whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" Before I could answer, the sound came again, a high, inhuman wail that sent chills down my spine. This time, Travis definitely heard it. His eyes went wide as he quickly unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the darkness. Mike and Chris had emerged from their tent as well, flashlights sweeping the surrounding woods. "What the hell was that?" Chris hissed, his usual bravado replaced by clear unease. "Probably just a mountain lion or something," Mike suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. As we huddled together, debating what to do, an eerie silence fell over the forest. The usual nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves had completely ceased, as if every living creature was holding its breath. That's when we saw it. Just beyond the dim circle of light from our dying campfire, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, huge and yellow-green, with vertical pupils like a cat's. But these eyes were far too large to belong to any normal animal. As we watched in stunned silence, a grotesque form began to take shape around those haunting eyes. It was vaguely humanoid, but impossibly tall and thin. Its limbs were unnaturally long and spindly, ending in wickedly curved claws. Patchy, matted fur covered its emaciated frame, but it was the creature's face that made my blood run cold. Its mouth was stretched in a horrific grin filled with needle-sharp teeth, and antlers, actual deer antlers, protruded from its misshapen skull. "Oh my God," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What is that thing?" Travis grabbed my hand, slowly backing us towards the tents. "We need to get out of here. Now." But before we could move, the creature let out another bone-chilling shriek and lunged forward with inhuman speed. Chris, who was closest, barely had time to cry out before those razor claws raked across his chest. Blood sprayed as he collapsed to the ground. Everything descended into chaos after that. Mike grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it at the monster, which recoiled with an angry hiss. Travis shoved me towards the trees, yelling for me to run. I hesitated, not wanting to leave them behind, but one look at the terror in Travis's eyes had me stumbling into the dark forest. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face and roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of a desperate struggle, shouting, that awful shrieking, and worst of all, the wet tearing of flesh. Tears streamed down my face as I pushed myself to keep going, praying that Travis and the others were right behind me. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I finally had to stop, gasping for breath. I leaned against a tree, straining my ears for any sign of pursuit. The forest was deathly quiet once again. No footsteps, no voices calling my name, just the pounding of my own heart. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of my situation set in. I was alone in the middle of unfamiliar woods in the dead of night, with no supplies and no idea which direction to go. And somewhere out there, that thing was still hunting. I slid down to sit at the base of the tree, hugging my knees to my chest as I tried to stifle my sobs. What had happened to the others? Were they even still alive? The image of Chris going down, blood spurting from his wounds, was seared into my mind. And Travis. Oh God, Travis. The last I'd seen of him, he was facing down that monster to buy me time to escape. The thought that I might never see him again was almost too much to bear. I'm not sure how long I sat there, shivering in the cool night air and jumping at every little sound. Eventually, as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I knew I had to move. I couldn't just wait here to be found, either by rescue or by that creature. Using the rising sun as a guide, I picked a direction and started walking. My legs were stiff and sore, my feet aching in shoes not meant for hiking, but the physical discomfort was almost welcome, giving me something to focus on besides the gnawing fear and worry. As I walked, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. That creature, it couldn't have been real, right? Maybe we'd all eaten some bad mushrooms or something, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The memory of those glowing eyes and that horrific grin was far too vivid to be a hallucination. It wasn't until several hours later that I finally heard the blessed sound of human voices. A search and rescue team had been dispatched when we failed to return to the ranger station as scheduled. I broke down sobbing as they approached, relief washing over me in waves. But my relief was short-lived. As I recounted my story to the rescue team and later to the police, it became clear that no one believed me. They searched the area where we had camped, but found no sign of a struggle, no blood, no bodies. Our tents and gear were still there, undisturbed. It was as if the others had simply vanished into thin air. I insisted that something terrible had happened, tried to describe the creature I'd seen. But the more I talked, the more I could see the doubt and skepticism in their eyes. They clearly thought I was either crazy or trying to cover up something more mundane. Days turned into weeks with no sign of Travis, Mike, or Chris. Search parties combed the mountains but found nothing. Eventually, the case went cold. Their families were devastated, and I know many of them blamed me. How could I have been the only one to make it out? Why couldn't I lead the searches back to where it happened? It's been years now, but I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, that inhuman shriek echoing in my ears. I've done research, trying to find any explanation for what I saw. The closest thing I've found is the legend of the Wendigo, a terrifying creature from Native American folklore, said to haunt the northern forests. But knowing the name doesn't make it any less terrifying. I still can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that thing is still lurking in the dark woods, waiting, hungry, and I live with the guilt of being the only survivor, wondering if there was something more I could have done to save the others. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, Most days I'm not even sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night, and I know that there are things in this world far more terrifying than most people can imagine. So the next time you're out in the wilderness and hear an odd sound in the night, just remember, it might not be your imagination. And whatever you do, don't look into those glowing eyes. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip, just the two of us getting away for the weekend. Michael had been going on and on about some local folklore, stories about a creature called a Wendigo that supposedly haunted these woods. I humored him, figuring it was just another of his passing obsessions. We set up our tent near a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. As night fell, we sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows and talking. Michael kept glancing into the darkness beyond our little circle of light, a mixture of excitement and nervousness on his face. I teased him about being scared of his own shadow. "I'm telling you, Jen, there's something out there," he insisted. "Can't you feel it? It's like we're being watched." I laughed it off, but a chill ran down my spine. The forest did seem unnaturally quiet. No crickets chirping, no rustling of small animals, just the crackle of our fire and the whisper of wind through the trees. As the night wore on, Michael grew more on edge. He kept jerking his head around at every little sound. I was starting to get annoyed, ready to call it a night and retreat to our tent. That's when we heard it, a long, low howl that echoed through the trees. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. Michael jumped to his feet, eyes wide. "Did you hear that? I told you." I stood up too, my heart racing. "It's probably just a wolf or something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But I didn't believe my own words. The howl came again, closer this time. It sounded almost human, but distorted and wrong, like someone was trying to mimic a wolf's cry but couldn't quite manage it. Michael grabbed my hand. "We need to go. Now." We scrambled to gather our things, shoving everything haphazardly into our backpacks. The sounds were getting closer, interspersed with the snapping of branches. Whatever was out there, it was big. Just as we finished packing, a twig snapped right at the edge of our campsite. We both froze, staring into the darkness. Two pinpricks of light reflected the glow of our dying fire, eyes watching us from the shadows. Michael let out a strangled gasp. I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice. Emerging from the trees was something. It was vaguely humanoid, but impossibly tall and thin. Its limbs were too long, joints bending at unnatural angles. The skin was a sickly grayish-white, stretched tight over protruding bones. But it was the face that haunted my nightmares for months after. A skull-like visage with sunken cheeks and eyes that glowed with an eerie yellow light. Its mouth, God, its mouth was full of needle-sharp teeth, far too many to fit in a human jaw. For a moment, we all just stared at each other, Michael and I paralyzed with fear, the creature regarding us with what seemed like curiosity. Then it let out another of those terrible howls, and we broke from our trance. "Run!" Michael yelled, grabbing my arm and yanking me towards the path that led back to our car. We tore through the forest, branches whipping at our faces as we stumbled over roots and rocks. I could hear it behind us, moving with inhuman speed. The snapping of branches and that awful keening cry spurred us on. I've never run so hard in my life. My lungs were burning, legs trembling with exhaustion, but pure adrenaline kept me going. Michael's hand was clamped around mine so tightly it hurt, but I clung to him just as desperately. We burst out of the tree line onto the gravel road where we'd parked. Our old sedan sat there like a beacon of hope. Michael fumbled with the keys, swearing under his breath as he tried to unlock the door with shaking hands. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was there at the edge of the woods, its elongated form silhouetted against the trees. It let out another of those bone-chilling howls. "Michael, hurry!" I screamed. He finally got the door open and we dove inside, slamming the locks down. Michael jammed the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. We peeled out onto the road, gravel spraying behind us. I twisted in my seat to look out the back window, half expecting to see that thing chasing after us. But the road behind us was empty. As we sped away, I caught one last glimpse of glowing eyes watching us from the darkness before we rounded a bend. We drove in tense silence for what felt like hours, both too shaken to speak. It wasn't until we hit the main highway that I felt like I could breathe again. Michael pulled over at a 24-hour diner, and we sat in the parking lot trying to process what had just happened. What was that thing?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. I mean, it looked like the descriptions of a Wendigo, but those are just stories. They can't be real." But we both knew what we'd seen. There was no rational explanation for the creature that had chased us through those woods. The weeks that followed were hard. We both had nightmares, waking up in cold sweats with the image of that skeletal face burned into our minds. Michael threw himself into researching, trying to find any information he could about what we'd encountered. I just wanted to forget it had ever happened. Our relationship was strained. Michael became obsessed, spending hours poring over old books and websites. I felt like I was losing him to this thing. We argued more, tensions running high as we both dealt with the trauma in our own ways. But slowly, we started to heal. We talked through our fears, held each other through the nightmares. In a way, the shared experience brought us closer together. We were the only ones who truly understood what the other had been through. It's been 6 months now since that night in the forest. We still don't have any answers, and I don't know if we ever will. But we've learned to live with the uncertainty, to find comfort in each other when the memories become too much. We haven't been camping since, and I don't know if we ever will again. The forest that once seemed so peaceful now holds only terror for us. But we're moving forward, day by day. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear that haunting howl in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. But Michael is always there, holding me close and reminding me that we're safe. We survived that night, and we'll keep surviving together. I don't know if I'll ever fully believe in the supernatural the way Michael does now. But I can't deny what we saw that night. It shattered my understanding of the world, forced me to confront the possibility that there are things out there beyond our comprehension. In a strange way, I'm almost grateful for the experience, not for the terror or the nightmares, but for how it changed us. We don't take each other for granted anymore. We cherish every moment, knowing how quickly everything can change. Life goes on, and we're trying to move past that night. But a part of me knows I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering what might be lurking in the shadows. And I'll always be grateful to have Michael by my side, the one person who truly understands. I don't know if we'll ever go back to those woods. Part of me is curious, wanting answers, but the memory of those glowing eyes and needle-sharp teeth is enough to keep me away. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. For now, we're focusing on healing, on building a life together that isn't defined by fear. It's not easy, but we're taking it one day at a time. And if I ever hear that haunting howl again, At least I know I won't face it alone. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be a relaxing solo camping trip to Moosehead Lake in Maine, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and clear my head. I'd been feeling restless for months, suffocated by the daily grind of my office job and the constant noise of Boston. Nature was calling to me, promising peace and renewal. The drive up to Moosehead Lake was beautiful, winding through dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever. As I set up my tent at a secluded campsite near the shore, I felt my stress melting away. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine. That first night, I sat by my campfire watching the stars emerge, feeling more content than I had in years. Everything changed the next morning. I woke at dawn, eager to explore the hiking trails around the lake. The morning mist was just starting to lift as I set out, creating an ethereal atmosphere. About an hour into my hike, I came across an old, half-hidden trail branching off the main path. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to see where it led. The trail quickly became overgrown, barely visible in places. I had to push through thick underbrush, the damp leaves brushing against my legs. Something about the density of the forest here felt off. The bird calls had faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. I should have turned back then, but some inexplicable urge drove me forward. After another 30 minutes of hiking, I emerged into a small clearing. What I saw there made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of 7 crudely carved wooden statues, each about 7 feet tall. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, but with elongated limbs and misshapen heads. The wood was dark and weathered, covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. As I stood there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The statues seemed to be oriented to face inward, as if watching over something in the center of their circle. With mounting dread, I forced myself to look. There, in the middle of the circle, was a stone altar. It was covered in dark stains that I prayed were just from years of exposure to the elements. Scattered around the base were small animal bones and what looked like strips of leather. The whole scene radiated an aura of ancient, primal menace that made every instinct scream at me to run. I started to back away slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural chanting coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. The sound seemed to be getting closer. Panic exploded in my chest and I turned to flee. In my haste, I tripped over an exposed root and went sprawling. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. To my horror, one of the wooden statues had shifted position, its head now turned to face me directly. I let out a strangled yell and ran blindly into the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the chanting growing louder behind me. I had no idea which direction I was going, driven only by terror and the need to escape. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst out onto the shore of the lake, gasping for breath. I stood there trembling, afraid to look back at the forest. The chanting had stopped, replaced by the normal sounds of birds and wind through the trees. Had I imagined it all? But the scratches on my arms and face from my panicked flight were all too real. I practically ran back to my campsite, throwing my gear haphazardly into my car. As I peeled out of the campground, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror that made my heart stop. A tall, misshapen figure standing at the tree line, watching me go. The entire drive back to Boston, I kept expecting to see that figure in my mirrors. Every rest stop, I scanned the parking lot nervously before getting out of the car. It wasn't until I was safely locked in my apartment that I finally started to relax. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But late at night, I would wake in a cold sweat, the sound of that inhuman chanting echoing in my mind. I found myself obsessively researching the history of Moosehead Lake, looking for any mentions of strange statues or cults in the area. I came across vague references to old Native American legends about guardian spirits of the forest, and whispered stories from early settlers about strange lights and sounds deep in the woods. Nothing concrete, but enough to feed my growing paranoia. A week after my return, I woke to find a small wooden figurine on my nightstand, a crude miniature version of the statues I'd seen in that clearing. I have no idea how it got there. My doors were locked, my windows secured. I destroyed it immediately, but the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd encountered in those woods had followed me home. I'm writing this now because I need someone, anyone, to know what happened to me. I'm planning to move, to get as far away from New England as possible. Maybe then I can finally escape the lingering dread that's consumed my life. But part of me fears it's already too late. That by entering that clearing, I opened a door that can never truly be closed. To anyone reading this, please heed my warning. If you're hiking near Moosehead Lake and come across an overgrown trail leading deep into the forest, turn back. Some things in this world are not meant to be discovered. Some mysteries should remain unsolved. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll be paying the price for the rest of my life. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. Every unexplained sound makes me jump. Every shadow in the corner of my eye could be one of those monstrous figures. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of those wooden statues silently watching me. The worst part is the dreams. Almost every night, I find myself back in that clearing, surrounded by those towering wooden figures. But in my dreams, they move. They dance in a slow, grotesque parody of human movement, their elongated limbs twisting at impossible angles. And always, always, that haunting chant echoes through the trees, growing louder and louder until I wake up screaming. I've tried to seek help, but how can I explain this to a therapist without sounding completely insane? I can barely believe it myself, and I lived through it. So I suffer in silence, going through the motions of my daily life while carrying this terrible secret. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it would have been better if I'd never left that clearing. At least then I'd know what happened to me, instead of living with this constant uncertainty and fear. But then I remember the malevolence I felt emanating from those statues, the ancient evil that seemed to pulse in the air, and I know I made the right choice in running. I'm sharing this story as a warning, but also as a plea. If anyone out there has experienced something similar, please reach out. Maybe together we can make sense of what's happening. Until then, I'll keep running, keep hiding, always looking over my shoulder for the day when those wooden guardians finally catch up to me. The day before Michael was set to leave, I pulled him aside. He was all excitement and nervous energy, practically bouncing on his toes as he packed his gear. I hated to dampen his spirits, but I needed to make sure he understood. "Michael," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I know you've been looking forward to this trip for months, but I need you to listen to me. Really listen." He must have sensed the gravity in my tone because his excited grin faded a bit. "What's up, Dad?" I took a deep breath. The wilderness. It's not just about the bears or the weather. There are things out there that can't always be explained. Things that don't show up in guidebooks or safety manuals. Michael's brow furrowed. Dad, come on. I've been camping before. I know how to handle myself. I know you do, son. But this is different. You're going deeper than you ever have before. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flare gun I'd purchased earlier that week. I want you to take this with you. His eyes widened. A flare gun? Isn't that a bit extreme? I pressed it into his hands. Maybe. Hopefully you won't need it. But if you do, you'll be glad you have it. I showed him how to load and fire it, making sure he understood its operation completely. As I watched him tuck it into his pack, I couldn't help but remember my own experiences in those woods. The strange lights I'd seen dancing between the trees one night, too fluid and purposeful to be fireflies. The eerie silence that had fallen over our campsite, as if every creature for miles had collectively held its breath. The inexplicable sense of being watched, even when I knew I was utterly alone. I'd never told Michael these stories. Part of me feared he'd think his old man had finally lost it. But as I looked at him now, so eager and unaware, I wondered if I should have prepared him more. There's one more thing, I said, my voice low. If you ever feel like something's not right, even if you can't put your finger on what it is, trust that feeling. Don't second-guess yourself. Just get out of there. Michael nodded, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. To him, these were just the ramblings of an overprotective father. I prayed he was right. The morning of his departure arrived all too quickly. As I helped him load his gear into the car, that sick feeling in my stomach intensified. I pulled him into a tight hug, probably squeezing harder than I meant to. Remember everything I taught you, I said. And Michael, be safe. He flashed me that confident grin of his. Always am, Dad. See you in a week. As I watched his car disappear down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more, said more. But what could I have told him? That sometimes, in the deepest parts of the wilderness, reality itself seems to bend. That I've seen things that defy explanation, things that still haunt my dreams. The next few days were torture. I tried to go about my normal routine, but I found myself constantly checking my phone, jumping at every ring or notification. My wife noticed my unease, but I brushed off her concerns. How could I explain a fear I couldn't even fully articulate? On the fourth day, I was out in the garage, mindlessly tinkering with my old truck, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Michael's number, but the contents made my blood run cold. Dad, something's wrong, not sure what. Feels like being watched. Shadows moving, not natural. Flare didn't work. Help. My hands shook as I read the message over and over. This was exactly what I'd feared, what I'd tried to warn him about. I immediately tried to call him back, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent a flurry of texts, each more frantic than the last, but received no response. I rushed into the house, grabbing my emergency pack and car keys. My wife, alarmed by my sudden burst of activity, asked what was wrong. I showed her the text, watching as the color drained from her face. I'm going after him, I said, already heading for the door. Wait, she called. Shouldn't we call the rangers? The police? I paused, my hand on the doorknob. And tell them what? That our son is being stalked by shadows? They'll think we're crazy. By the time they take us seriously, it might be too late. She knew I was right. We both knew the authorities wouldn't understand, couldn't understand. This was something I had to handle myself. The drive to the trailhead was a blur. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What if I was too late? What if whatever was out there had already... No, I couldn't think like that. I had to focus. As I parked and shouldered my pack, I noticed how quiet it was. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I pulled out my compass and the map of Michael's planned route, plotting the quickest path to his last known location. The forest seemed to close in around me as I hiked, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. Every snapping twig, every shifting shadow made me flinch. I called out Michael's name until my voice was hoarse, but only my own echo answered. As night fell, the forest transformed. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting strange, shifting patterns on the ground. More than once, I could have sworn I saw something moving just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I pushed on through the night, driven by a desperate need to find my son. As dawn broke, I finally reached the area where I believed Michael's camp should be. What I found made my heart sink. The campsite was a mess. Michael's tent was shredded, his supplies scattered everywhere, but there was no blood, no signs of a struggle with any animal I knew. It was as if a tornado had touched down in this one specific spot. "Michael!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Michael, where are you?" That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden by a bush, was Michael's backpack, and protruding from the top was the flare gun I'd given him. With trembling hands, I picked it up. It was fully loaded, never fired. Whatever had happened here, Michael hadn't even had a chance to use it. As I stood there, clutching the unfired flare gun, the full weight of the situation hit me. My son was gone, taken by something I'd always feared but never fully understood, and I had no idea how to find him or what I was truly up against. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by a mixture of grief and determination. I wouldn't leave this forest without my son, no matter what horrors I had to face. As I began to plan my next move, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, flare gun at the ready, and found myself face to face with... I was never much of a believer in the supernatural. Growing up, I always thought my dad's hunting stories were just tall tales meant to entertain us kids around the campfire. But after what happened to me last fall, I'm not so sure anymore. It was early November, and I had decided to do a solo hunting trip in the Appalachian Mountains. My dad used to take me there when I was younger, but I hadn't been back in years. Something about those misty forests had always creeped me out a bit, if I'm being honest. But I figured I was just being silly. I was a grown man now, after all. I set up camp near an old logging road, about 10 miles from the nearest town. The first couple days were uneventful. I saw some deer tracks, but no actual deer. On the third night, I was sitting by my campfire when I heard something large moving through the underbrush nearby. Thinking it might be a bear, I grabbed my rifle and flashlight. As I swept the beam of light across the tree line, I caught a glimpse of movement, but it wasn't a bear. For just a split second, I saw a tall, dark figure duck behind a tree. It moved in a strange, fluid way that didn't seem quite human. My heart started racing. I called out, thinking maybe it was another hunter, but got no response. I didn't sleep much that night. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had me on edge. I kept thinking about the stories my dad used to tell, about things in these woods that defied explanation. At the time, I had laughed them off as campfire tales. Now, they didn't seem so funny. The next morning, I decided to pack up and head home early. As I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something odd. Deep gouges in the bark of a nearby tree, about 7 feet off the ground. They looked almost like claw marks, but larger than any bear claws I'd ever seen. A chill ran down my spine. I shouldered my pack and set off down the old logging road, eager to get back to my truck. The forest felt different now, oppressive, watchful. Every shadow seemed to conceal some lurking threat. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being followed. About halfway back to my vehicle, I came across a small clearing. In the center stood a massive gnarled oak tree. As I approached, I noticed something hanging from one of the lower branches. Getting closer, I realized it was a deer carcass, impaled on a broken limb about 12 feet off the ground. The body was torn open, its insides mostly gone. But what really got me was how it had gotten up there. No bear or mountain lion could have done that. I hurried past, my pace quickening. The shadows seemed to be growing longer, darker, even though it was barely past noon. The wind picked up, and I could have sworn I heard whispers carried on the breeze, unintelligible words in a language I didn't recognize. That's when I saw it again, a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I broke into a jog, no longer caring about stealth or tracking game. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I came face to face with something. It was vaguely humanoid, but impossibly tall, at least 8 feet. Its arms were unnaturally long, ending in hands with fingers like claws. But the worst part was its head. Atop a too thin neck sat what looked like a deer skull, complete with a massive rack of antlers. Empty eye sockets stared at me, and I could see rotting flesh still clinging to the bone in places. I stood there, frozen in terror, for what felt like an eternity. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched me. Finally, some primal instinct kicked in and I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I don't know how long I ran for. My lungs were burning, and I was covered in scratches and bruises from low-hanging branches. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. The logging road was nowhere in sight. I was lost in the depths of the forest, and night was falling fast. Panic started to set in. I fumbled for my phone, but of course there was no signal out here. As the last light faded from the sky, the forest came alive with sounds, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and something that sounded almost like laughter, but not quite human. I stumbled through the darkness, using my flashlight sparingly to conserve battery. Every shadow seemed to move. Every tree looked like a looming figure. More than once I caught glimpses of eyes reflecting the beam of my light, only to vanish when I looked directly at them. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, my flashlight flickered and died. I was plunged into total darkness, with only the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy above. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps coming closer, and a sound like antlers scraping against tree bark. I ran blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I could hear it behind me, getting closer. In my panic, I tripped over an exposed root and went sprawling. As I scrambled to my feet, my hand brushed against something smooth and cold, a deer skull half buried in the leaves. Suddenly, the forest went silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then, a twig snapped directly behind me. I slowly turned around, and there it was again, the antlered figure looming over me. This close, I could smell the stench of decay coming off it. I closed my eyes, certain this was the end. But then, nothing happened. When I opened my eyes again, the thing was gone. In fact, everything looked different. I was standing on the logging road, just a few hundred yards from where I had parked my truck. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there. Was it all some kind of hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion? Or was there really something in those woods, something that defies rational explanation? All I know is I won't be going back to those mountains anytime soon. And now, when I hear my dad's old hunting stories, I listen with a lot more respect and a lot less skepticism. I was at the reference desk, catching up on some cataloging work, when two young people approached, a man and a woman who looked to be in their mid-20s. They introduced themselves as Michael and Jennifer and said they were doing research on local folklore and legends. Specifically, they were interested in finding information about the Wendigo. Now, I've had plenty of patrons ask about local myths and urban legends over the years. It's a fairly common request, especially around Halloween. But something about these two immediately put me on edge. There was an intensity to their gazes, an urgency in their voices that seemed out of place for what should have been a casual research project. I directed them to our local history section and pulled a few relevant books on Native American folklore of the region. As I handed over the materials, Jennifer asked if we had any more obscure or hard-to-find sources on the topic. She mentioned they were looking for first-hand accounts or original documents related to Wendigo sightings. A chill ran down my spine at her words. I'm not sure why, but I felt a strong urge to deflect and downplay the request. I'm afraid most of what we have is pretty standard stuff, I said with a forced smile. Mostly just retellings of old legends. Nothing too exciting. Michael leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Are you sure there's nothing else? We've heard rumors that some libraries keep certain materials, off the record, so to speak, accounts that are too disturbing or unbelievable for general circulation. I felt my heart start to race. How could they possibly know about that? I've worked here for years, and even I'm not supposed to know about the restricted archives in the basement. I tried to keep my face neutral as I replied, I'm not aware of anything like that here. We're just a small-town library, after all. Jennifer gave me a long, searching look. You seem nervous, she said softly. Is everything all right? I plastered on another fake smile. Of course, just a bit tired. Long day, you know how it is. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some work to finish up before closing. I hurried back to my desk, my mind reeling. As I pretended to focus on my computer screen, I kept stealing glances at Michael and Jennifer. They had settled into a quiet corner with the books I'd given them, but I could tell they were watching me too. The air felt thick with tension and unspoken questions. As closing time approached, I made the usual announcements and started shutting down the computers. Michael and Jennifer lingered until the very last minute, whispering to each other and casting furtive looks my way. Just before they left, Jennifer approached the desk one last time. Thank you for your help tonight, she said. Then, leaning in close, she added in a whisper, we know there's more to the story, and we'll find out the truth, one way or another. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I watched them walk out the door. Once they were gone, I sagged against the desk, my legs shaky. How much did they really know? And how had they found out about the restricted archives? I debated calling my supervisor to report the incident, but something held me back. What if this went higher up than I realized? What if reporting it only brought more unwanted attention? After locking up, I made my way down to the basement, using the special key that only senior staff possessed. The restricted archives were housed in a climate-controlled room behind a heavy metal door. Inside, rows of shelves held boxes of documents, artifacts, and books too dangerous or controversial for public consumption. I pulled out the box labeled Wendigo, with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of first-hand accounts spanning centuries, terrifying tales of encounters with the mythical creature, along with photographs and physical evidence that defied rational explanation. This was the kind of material Michael and Jennifer had been seeking, the unvarnished truth behind the legends. As I leafed through the documents, my mind raced. Why was this information kept hidden? Who decided what the public was allowed to know about the supernatural world around us? And now that Michael and Jennifer were on the trail, how long could these secrets stay buried? I stayed in that room for hours, poring over the restricted materials and grappling with my conscience. On one hand, I had sworn an oath to protect this information and keep it out of public hands. But on the other, didn't people deserve to know the truth about the world they lived in? As dawn broke, I finally emerged from the basement, bleary-eyed and conflicted. I had no answers, only more questions. But one thing was certain. Michael and Jennifer's visit had shaken me to my core and forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my role as a gatekeeper of forbidden knowledge. In the days that followed, I found myself jumping at every shadow, checking over my shoulder constantly. Every time the library door opened, I half expected to see Michael and Jennifer again, demanding answers. But they didn't return. Instead, I noticed other strange occurrences. Books on folklore and the supernatural would be found out of place, as if someone had been rifling through them after hours. The security cameras experienced unexplained outages, and more than once I could have sworn I saw a figure lurking in the stacks, only to vanish when I went to investigate. My colleagues seemed oblivious to the growing sense of unease that permeated the library. When I tried to casually bring up the topic of restricted materials, they gave me blank looks or quickly changed the subject. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, allowing me to see a hidden world that existed alongside our everyday reality. 1 week after Michael and Jennifer's visit, I arrived at work to find my office in disarray. Drawers had been pulled open, papers strewn about, but nothing seemed to be missing. On my desk was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in bold letters. The truth cannot stay hidden forever. I crumpled the paper in my fist, my heart pounding. This had gone too far. I needed answers, and I knew there was only one place to find them. That night, after the library closed, I made my way once again to the restricted archives. But this time, I wasn't there to simply read the files. I began gathering up the most crucial documents, the Wendigo accounts, yes, but also materials on other creatures and phenomena that lurked just beyond the edge of human understanding. As I stuffed the papers into my bag, I heard a noise behind me. Spinning around, I came face to face with an elderly man I'd never seen before. He wore an old-fashioned suit and had a grave expression on his lined face. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said softly. "Some knowledge is restricted for a reason." I stumbled backward, clutching my bag. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" The old man smiled sadly. "I've been here all along, watching and waiting. Just as there have always been those who seek the truth, there have always been those tasked with guarding it." He took a step toward me, his eyes flickering with an otherworldly light. "You have a choice to make now. Continue down this path, and there's no turning back. The world you think you know will never be the same. Or you can put those documents back where they belong and forget this ever happened." I stood frozen, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to run, to put this all behind me and return to my normal life. But a larger part knew that was impossible now. I had seen too much, learned too much to ever go back. Taking a deep breath, I squared my shoulders and met the old man's gaze. "I choose the truth," I said firmly. He nodded slowly, a mix of approval and sadness in his eyes. "Very well. But remember, with knowledge comes responsibility and danger." With that, he turned and walked into the shadows at the back of the room, seeming to fade away before my eyes. I blinked, unsure if what I'd seen was real or some sort of stress-induced hallucination. Clutching my bag of forbidden knowledge, I made my way out of the library on shaky legs. As I stepped into the cool night air, I knew my life would never be the same. I had become part of something larger than myself, a hidden war between those who sought the truth and those who guarded it. Michael and Jennifer were still out there somewhere, searching for answers. And now, for better or worse, I was on their side. The world was stranger and more dangerous than I had ever imagined, but I was determined to face whatever came next with open eyes. As I drove home, my mind swirling with ancient legends and modern conspiracies, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed deeper, the night more alive with unseen presences. But for the first time in my life, I felt truly awake. Whatever happens next, I know one thing for certain. The truth is out there, and I'm going to find it, no matter the cost. The first few days were uneventful as I hiked deeper into the backcountry, setting up camp each night in clearings nestled among towering pines. The silence was profound, no sounds of civilization, just the whisper of wind through branches and occasional animal calls in the distance. I felt a sense of peace, believing I had found the solitude I was seeking. On the fourth night, things took a sinister turn. I was huddled in my tent, listening to the wind howl outside, when I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching through the snow. At first I dismissed it as just a deer or other animal, but then came a blood-curdling shriek that made my hair stand on end. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite human, not quite animal. My heart began racing as I fumbled for my flashlight with trembling hands. I unzipped the tent and shone the beam into the darkness, scanning the tree line. For a moment I saw nothing. Then a pair of eyes caught the light, glowing an unnatural yellow. They blinked and vanished. I told myself it must have been a wolf or mountain lion, but deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. Sleep eluded me that night as I lay awake, straining to hear any sounds of movement outside. As dawn broke, I eagerly packed up camp, planning to hike back to civilization. But as I studied my map and compass, my blood ran cold. Somehow, impossibly, I had become completely turned around. The landmarks I used to navigate were unfamiliar. It was as if the forest itself had shifted around me. Panicked, I picked a direction and started walking, hoping to stumble across a trail or road. Hours passed as I trudged through deepening snow. The temperature plummeted and wind whipped between the trees. Before long, I realized I was hopelessly lost. As dusk approached, I knew I had to make camp for the night. I found a small clearing and quickly set up my tent with numb fingers. That's when I noticed the tracks in the snow, massive footprints, vaguely human-shaped but far too large. They circled the entire campsite before disappearing into the woods. Terror gripped me as I recalled stories I'd read about the Wendigo, the malevolent spirit of Native American lore said to possess humans, filling them with an insatiable hunger. I'd always assumed it was just a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and cannibalism. Now I wasn't so sure. I tried to convince myself I was just spooked and letting my imagination run wild. But as night fell, that hideous shriek echoed through the forest again, closer this time. I huddled in my sleeping bag, praying for morning to come quickly. Sleep must have overtaken me at some point because I jolted awake to the sound of sniffing and scratching right outside my tent. The canvas wall bulged inward as something massive pressed against it. I could hear ragged, labored breathing, like a starving animal catching the scent of prey. Frozen in fear, I watched as long, grotesque fingers with razor-sharp claws sliced through the tent fabric. A face appeared in the gash, emaciated, with sunken eyes glowing that sickly yellow. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. I screamed and scrambled backwards, fumbling for my knife. The creature let out that bone-chilling shriek again as it tore into the tent. In a burst of adrenaline, I managed to unzip the back of the tent and tumble out into the snow. I ran blindly through the pitch-black forest, branches whipping my face as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind me, I could hear the monster crashing through the underbrush in pursuit, its agonized wails growing closer. My legs burned and my lungs ached in the frigid air, but sheer terror kept me moving. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put distance between myself and that thing. After what felt like hours, I burst out of the tree line onto a snow-covered road. Miraculously, a pickup truck was approaching in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The truck screeched to a halt, and an older man leaned out the window, eyes wide with concern. "Jesus, son, what happened to you?" he asked as I scrambled into the passenger seat. I must have looked half mad, covered in cuts and scratches, babbling about monsters in the woods. The man, Frank, listened patiently as I poured out my story. To my surprise, he didn't seem entirely skeptical. "You're lucky to be alive," he said gravely. "These forests hold ancient spirits. The Ojibwe warned the early settlers about the Wendigo, but most didn't listen. Every few years, someone goes missing out there. The ones who make it back are never the same." Frank explained that he was part Ojibwe himself, and his grandfather had passed down traditional knowledge about the Wendigo. According to legend, it was once a human who had been possessed by an evil spirit after resorting to cannibalism. Now it wandered the North Woods, consumed by a never-ending hunger. "The Wendigo is more than just a creature," Frank told me. "It represents the darkness that lives in all of us, greed, selfishness, the capacity for cruelty. The elders say it appears in times of famine or great hardship as a test. Those who give in to their baser instincts risk becoming Wendigo themselves." I shuddered, recalling the gaunt, inhuman face I'd seen. Had that thing once been human? The thought was almost too horrible to contemplate. Frank drove me to the nearest town, where I was treated for hypothermia and minor injuries. The authorities searched the area where I'd been camping, but found no sign of the creature I described. My torn tent and scattered supplies were recovered, but they attributed the damage to a bear attack. I knew the truth, of course. In the following months, I threw myself into researching Wendigo lore, poring over anthropological texts and first-hand accounts from trappers and explorers. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that I had encountered a real Wendigo that night in the Minnesota wilderness. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the echoes of that unearthly shriek ringing in my ears. I've come to believe that the Wendigo is more than just a physical monster. It's the embodiment of winter's cruelty, of isolation and desperation. It preys not just on human flesh, but on the human spirit. I'll never forget Frank's parting words to me. "The Wendigo is always hungry, always hunting. But remember, we all have the power to resist that darkness within ourselves. Stay true to your humanity, even in the darkest times. That's how we defeat the spirit of the Wendigo." Those words have become a mantra for me. Whenever I'm tempted by greed or selfishness, I remember my brush with that ancient evil. I strive to be generous and kind, to nurture the best parts of my humanity, because I've seen the alternative, and it's far more terrifying than I ever could have imagined. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, always dreaming of becoming a police officer. But it wasn't until that fateful summer at Camp Willow Creek that my path truly crystallized. I was 15 years old, excited for 2 weeks of outdoor adventure with my best friend Robert. We'd been looking forward to it for months. The first few days were amazing, hiking, canoeing, roasting marshmallows around the campfire. But on the fourth night, everything changed. A group of us snuck out after lights out to explore the woods. We thought we were so rebellious and cool. God, we were stupid kids. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Robert grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with fear. Before we could react, something massive burst through the trees. In the moonlight, I caught glimpses of matted fur, gleaming fangs, and eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow. We ran. Oh God, we ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind us, getting closer with each second. The counselors found us an hour later, huddled in a cave, sobbing and babbling about monsters. They searched the woods but found nothing, told us it was probably just a bear. But I knew what I saw. That thing wasn't natural. Robert was never the same after that night. He became withdrawn, jumpy. Eventually his parents pulled him out of school and moved away. I hear he still struggles with severe anxiety and PTSD. As for me, that night lit a fire in me. I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness, of being prey. I vowed to never feel that way again, and to protect others from experiencing that terror. I threw myself into self-defense classes, started working out religiously. When I turned 18, I enrolled in the police academy. It wasn't easy, the rigorous physical training, the countless hours of study. But every time I felt like giving up, I'd remember that night in the woods, and it would push me harder. After graduation, I requested assignment to the K-9 unit. There was something comforting about having a powerful, loyal dog by my side. My first partner was a German shepherd named Max. Together, we patrolled the streets, keeping our community safe. But I never forgot about what happened at Camp Willow Creek. In my off hours, I'd research cryptozoology, unexplained phenomena. I knew most of my colleagues would think I was crazy if they knew, so I kept it to myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there were things out there beyond our understanding. Years passed, and I rose through the ranks. Eventually, I made detective. It was during a particularly brutal murder investigation that things took a turn for the strange again. The victim had been found in the woods, torn apart in a way that didn't match any animal attack I'd ever seen. As I stood at the crime scene, I felt that same prickle of fear I'd experienced all those years ago. I started noticing patterns, similar attacks happening every few years, always around the full moon. The brass wrote it off as animal attacks or particularly vicious serial killers, but I knew better. I began my own off-the-books investigation, tracking lunar cycles, researching local legends. It led me to an old Native American shaman living on the outskirts of town. When I told him what I'd seen, both as a kid and in my work, he nodded gravely. "The veil between worlds grows thin," he said. "Ancient spirits walk among us once more." He taught me rituals of protection, how to make talismans to ward off evil. I felt ridiculous at first, a hardened detective dabbling in what seemed like superstition. But I couldn't deny the results. The attacks stopped. Now, 30 years after that night at Camp Willow Creek, I'm the chief of police in my hometown. To most, I'm just a dedicated public servant. But there's a select few who know to come to me when things get weird. The teenager who swears something tried to drag them into the lake. The hiker who encountered a creature that couldn't possibly exist. I listen, I believe them, and I do what I can to keep them safe. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out into the dark woods behind my house. I think about Robert, about how differently our lives turned out. I wonder if that thing is still out there, waiting. But I'm not that scared kid anymore. I'm ready, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure no one else has to go through what we did. This job isn't just about upholding the law. It's about protecting people from the things that lurk in the shadows, the things most people don't even know exist. Every time I pin on my badge, I remember why I chose this path. It's not just a career, it's a calling, a way to turn that night of terror into something meaningful, to be the shield between innocence and the darkness that threatens to consume it. I may not be able to change what happened to us at Camp Willow Creek, but I can damn well make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else on my watch. So I keep my eyes open, my weapon close, and my resolve strong. Because in this line of work, you never know when you might encounter something that defies explanation. And when that happens, I'll be ready. For Robert, for that terrified 15-year-old version of myself, and for everyone else who needs protection from the things that go bump in the night. This is my story. This is my purpose. And I wouldn't have it any other way. My old friend Dave Whitman and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd known each other since college and tried to get together for an outdoor excursion at least once a year. This time, we decided to spend a week exploring the wilderness of Wyoming. We arrived at the campground on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies, a light breeze, and temperatures in the mid-70s. As we set up our tents and unpacked our gear, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was exactly what I needed after a stressful year of adjusting to retirement. That first night around the campfire, Dave and I reminisced about old times and made plans for the week ahead. We'd do some hiking, try our luck at fishing, and just enjoy being out in nature. With full bellies and hearts, we turned in early, excited for what the next day would bring. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rustling outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a raccoon scavenging for food scraps. But then I heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite. They were too loud to be from any normal forest creature. My heart started racing as I strained my ears to make sense of what I was hearing. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, not daring to move a muscle. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. This sound was almost human, but not quite. I wanted to call out to Dave to make sure he was okay, but I was paralyzed with fear. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps slowly faded away. I lay there for the rest of the night, wide awake and on edge, convinced that whatever had visited our camp was still out there watching us. When morning finally came, I practically leapt out of my tent. Dave was already up, looking as tired and shaken as I felt. "Did you hear that last night?" I asked him urgently. He nodded, his face pale. "What the hell was that, Mike?" We spent the morning debating whether we should pack up and leave, but ultimately decided to stay. We were both rational men after all. It was probably just some large animal passing through, we reasoned. No need to cut our trip short over one strange night. How wrong we were. That afternoon, we decided to do some hiking to take our minds off the previous night's scare. We packed some snacks and water and set off on a trail that would take us deeper into the forest. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. About 2 hours into our hike, we came across something that made my blood run cold. There, in a small clearing, was a crude structure made of branches and animal bones. It looked like some kind of primitive altar. Scattered around it were bits of fur, feathers, and what looked disturbingly like human hair. "We need to get out of here," Dave whispered, his voice shaking. I couldn't have agreed more. We turned to head back the way we came, but suddenly realized we weren't sure which direction that was. In our haste to get away from the clearing, we'd gotten turned around. As panic started to set in, we heard that same horrible growl from the night before, only this time it was much closer. We took off running, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail or where we were going. All that mattered was getting away from whatever was behind us. I don't know how long we ran. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer terror kept me going. Suddenly, Dave cried out. I turned to see him sprawled on the ground, his ankle twisted at an odd angle. "Go!" he yelled at me. "Get help!" But before I could do anything, a massive shape burst out of the trees. In the fading light, I caught glimpses of matted fur, long limbs, and glowing yellow eyes. The creature, the Jaeger, as I would later learn it was called, snatched Dave up like he weighed nothing and disappeared back into the forest. I stood there, frozen in shock and horror. My best friend had just been taken by some kind of monster, and I had done nothing to stop it. Shame and fear warred within me as I tried to decide what to do. In the end, self-preservation won out. I ran. Somehow, I made it back to our campsite. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, praying I'd have enough signal to call for help. By some miracle, I got through to the park rangers. I babbled about Dave being taken, about the monster in the woods. They must have thought I was crazy or drunk, but they said they'd send someone out to check on us. I spent that night huddled in my tent, jumping at every sound. I kept expecting the Jaeger to come for me next. When morning came, and there was still no sign of the rangers, I knew I had to go back out there and try to find Dave myself. I armed myself with a hunting knife and a makeshift torch, then set off in the direction we'd run the day before. As I retraced our steps, I found signs of our passage: broken branches, disturbed earth, even a scrap of Dave's shirt caught on a thorny bush. The forest seemed different now, more sinister. The trees loomed over me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every shadow held the potential for danger, but I pressed on, calling Dave's name and straining my ears for any response. After hours of searching, I stumbled upon a cave hidden behind a thick curtain of vines. The stench emanating from it nearly made me gag, but then I heard something, a weak groan that could only be Dave. Steeling myself, I entered the cave. The smell of death and decay was overwhelming. Bones and rotting carcasses littered the floor, and there, propped up against the far wall, was Dave. He was alive, but barely. His clothes were torn and bloody, and his eyes had a glassy, unfocused look. I rushed to him, my heart pounding. "Dave! Dave! Can you hear me? We need to get out of here!" I tried to help him up, but he was too weak to stand. That's when I heard it, that terrifying growl, echoing through the cave. The Jaeger appeared at the mouth of the cave, blocking our exit. In the dim light, I could finally see it clearly. It was like something out of a nightmare. Over 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a twisted mix of human and animal. Its yellow eyes fixed on me with predatory intelligence. I knew in that moment that I was going to die. But a strange calm came over me. If this was it, I was going to go down fighting. I raised my knife and torch, placing myself between the monster and Dave. The Jaeger lunged at me with inhuman speed. I swung my torch wildly, managing to catch its fur on fire. The creature howled in pain and fury, thrashing about the cave. In its frenzy, it knocked loose some rocks from the ceiling. I saw my chance and shoved with all my might, causing a cave-in that crushed the Jaeger beneath tons of rock. Somehow, through sheer adrenaline and determination, I managed to drag Dave out of the cave and back to our campsite. The Rangers arrived shortly after, along with paramedics who rushed Dave to the hospital. He survived, but the trauma of what happened left him a changed man. As for me, I've never been camping again. The memories of that horrifying encounter in Shoshone National Forest still haunt my dreams. I've tried to research the Jaeger, to make sense of what we experienced, but there's little concrete information out there, just whispered legends and campfire stories. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, but then I look at the scars on my arms from that final confrontation, and I know it was real. The Jaeger was real, and even though I killed it, I can't shake the feeling that there might be more out there, waiting in the dark forests of the world. So I stay in the city now, surrounded by the comforting sounds of civilization. But on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself listening for that terrible growl and praying I never hear it again. The morning of the trip, I remember feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness as I climbed onto the school bus with my classmates. Mrs. Korjanen, our teacher, did a head count before we set off on the 2-hour drive to the castle. She was a kind older woman, always patient with us kids, with her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. As we drove through the Finnish countryside, Mrs. Korjanen told us about the history of Olavinlinna. Built in the 15th century, it was one of the northernmost medieval stone fortresses still standing. She explained how it had defended against Russian invasions and been the site of many battles over the centuries. I pictured brave knights fighting off attackers, never imagining the true horrors that awaited within those ancient walls. When we finally arrived, I gasped at my first sight of the massive gray stone towers looming over us. The castle seemed to radiate an aura of power and mystery. As we walked across the wooden bridge to the entrance, I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm summer day. Looking back, I think some part of me sensed the evil residing there, even then. Our tour guide, a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform, led us through the castle's winding corridors and up narrow spiral staircases. He pointed out arrow slits, secret passages, and remnants of medieval life, but I was only half listening, distracted by an odd feeling of being watched. More than once, I thought I glimpsed movement in the shadows, only to find nothing there when I looked closer. About halfway through the tour, we entered the castle's great hall. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating the vaulted stone ceiling and faded tapestries on the walls. As the guide described feasts and celebrations once held there, I noticed Mrs. Korjanen seemed distracted. She kept glancing around nervously, as if searching for something. Suddenly she gasped and pointed to a darkened alcove. "Did you see that?" she whispered to the guide. He looked confused and shook his head. Mrs. Korjanen's face went pale. She muttered something about needing air and hurried out of the hall. The guide continued his talk, but I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the fear I'd seen in Mrs. Korjanen's eyes. What had she seen that scared her so badly? After a few minutes, I quietly slipped away from the group to check on her. I found her in a small side chamber, staring at an old painting on the wall. It depicted a gruesome battle scene, with knights locked in combat against shadowy, monstrous figures. As I approached, Mrs. Korjanen turned to me with a look of terror. "We have to leave," she said urgently. "It's not safe here." Before I could respond, a bone-chilling screech echoed through the chamber. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. Mrs. Korjanen grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Run!" she yelled, but it was too late. A swirling vortex of darkness erupted from the painting, tendrils of inky blackness reaching out towards us. Mrs. Korjanen shoved me towards the door, putting herself between me and the growing shadow. I stumbled backwards, too terrified to look away. The darkness enveloped Mrs. Korjanen. I heard her scream, a sound of pure agony that still echoes in my nightmares. Then, in an instant, both she and the shadow vanished. The painting on the wall was blank, as if the battle scene had never existed. I don't remember much after that. I must have run screaming back to the group. The rest of the day was a blur of police questioning and frantic searching. They never found Mrs. Korjanen or any trace of what happened to her. Eventually, they concluded she must have gotten lost or fallen into some hidden part of the castle. But I knew the truth, even if no one believed me. For years afterwards, I struggled with nightmares and panic attacks. My parents sent me to therapists, but nothing helped. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe that shadows had come to life and swallowed my teacher? As I got older, I became obsessed with researching Olivine Lina's history, searching for any clues about what really happened that day. I discovered old legends about the castle being a focal point for supernatural energy, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. There were stories of people disappearing over the centuries, of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena. But it wasn't until I was in college that I found something truly significant. In a dusty archive of medieval documents, I came across mentions of an ancient order of knights who had protected the castle against otherworldly threats. They wielded powerful artifacts, including wooden amulets said to ward off evil. The description matched a strange pendant my grandmother had given me years ago, a small disc of dark wood carved with intricate symbols. She told me it was a family heirloom, passed down for generations. I'd always worn it as a good luck charm, never realizing its true significance. Armed with this knowledge, I knew what I had to do. 20 years after that fateful school trip, I returned to Olivine Lina Castle. I signed up for a night tour, planning to slip away and confront whatever evil still lurked there. As twilight fell, I found myself once again walking across that wooden bridge, my heart pounding. The tour group was small, just me, a young couple, and our guide. As we entered the castle, I clutched my amulet tightly, drawing strength from it. Everything seemed normal at first, but as we climbed to the upper levels, I began to notice subtle wrongness, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, whispers at the edge of hearing, a oppressive weight in the air, as if the very stones were alive and malevolent. In the great hall, I made my move. I pretended to feel ill and told the guide I needed a moment alone. As soon as the group moved on, I sprinted for the chamber where Mrs. Korjanen had vanished. The room was dark and musty, apparently unused for years. The painting still hung on the wall, but now it showed only an empty battlefield. I approached cautiously, amulet held out before me like a shield. "I know you're here," I said, my voice shaking. "Show yourself." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the temperature plummeted. The shadows in the corners began to writhe and pulse. A low, inhuman growl filled the air. The darkness coalesced into a humanoid shape. As it solidified, I gasped in horror. It was Mrs. Korjanen. or what was left of her. Her skin was gray and withered, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. When she spoke, her voice was a raspy whisper. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. "This place is ours now." I held up the amulet. "What are you? What have you done with my teacher?" The thing wearing Mrs. Corgenon's face snarled, "Your teacher is gone. We are ancient. We have waited centuries for the stars to align, for the barriers between worlds to weaken. Soon, we will be strong enough to break free of this prison and claim your world for our own." It lunged at me, clawed hands outstretched. I stumbled backwards, thrusting the amulet towards it. The wooden disc glowed with a soft blue light. The creature shrieked and recoiled. "You cannot stop us," it hissed. "We are legion. We are eternal." More shadows were gathering, taking monstrous forms. I knew I was outmatched. With a final look at the thing that had once been my teacher, I turned and ran. I barely made it out of the castle, the inhuman howls of the shadow creatures echoing behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a mass of writhing darkness pouring from the castle's windows. In the years since, I've dedicated my life to researching the supernatural threat lurking in Olavinlinna. I've connected with others who have had similar experiences at the castle. Together, we're working to find a way to seal the evil away for good. But every night, I still dream of that day. I see Mrs. Corgenon's terrified face as the shadows consume her. I hear that unearthly screech, and I wonder, how long before the barriers fall and that ancient evil is unleashed upon our world? I don't know if we'll be ready when that day comes, but I do know this. As long as I live, I'll keep fighting to protect others from the horrors I witnessed in that castle. Because some evils are too great to ignore, no matter how much we might want to. I was just 17 when I took a summer job as a counselor at Camp Whispering Pines back in '99. Man, I thought it was going to be all fun and games. You know, teaching kids how to canoe, roasting marshmallows, typical camp stuff. But what happened that summer, it still haunts me to this day. It all started about 2 weeks into the camp session. Everything seemed normal at first. The kids were having a blast, my fellow counselors were cool, and the weather was perfect. But there was always something a little off about those woods surrounding the camp. They just felt, I don't know, alive somehow, like they were watching us. Anyway, it was a Tuesday night when things went to hell. We had just finished up the evening campfire, and were getting the kids settled into their cabins for lights out. I was doing a final sweep of the grounds with Jenny, one of the other counselors, when we heard this blood-curdling scream coming from the direction of cabin 3. We took off running and burst through the door to find total chaos. Kids were crying and shouting, huddled in the corners, and Timmy, this scrawny 10-year-old, was just gone. His bunk was empty, the window wide open. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm for the kids' sake. It took him," one of the boys whimpered. "Sam took Timmy." Jenny and I exchanged a look. We'd heard whispers about Sam from some of the older campers, some kind of boogeyman that was supposed to haunt these woods. But come on, it was just a stupid camp legend, right? Wrong. So wrong. We radioed the other counselors and organized a search party. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods with Jenny and 2 other guys, Mike and Dave. The rest stayed behind to watch the kids and call the rangers for backup. Those woods, man, they were like a different world at night. The trees seemed to close in around us, branches snagging at our clothes, and it was dead silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the crunch of leaves under our feet and our own ragged breathing. We'd been searching for maybe an hour when we heard it, this low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. More like, I don't know, like something trying to imitate an animal's sound, but not quite getting it right. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Timmy, you out there, buddy?" That's when we saw it. Just for a second, illuminated by our flashlight beams, a figure darting between the trees about 50 yards ahead. It was tall, way taller than any man I'd ever seen, with limbs that seemed too long and bent at unnatural angles. And its face. God, I still see that face in my nightmares. Pale, almost glowing in the darkness, with black pits where the eyes should be and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth. Jenny screamed. Mike started praying. And me? I just stood there, paralyzed with fear as this thing stared right at us. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows with inhuman speed, and clutched in one of its misshapen hands was a small, limp form that could only be Timmy. We ran. What else could we do? We ran back towards the camp, branches whipping our faces, roots trying to trip us up. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the underbrush, that awful growl getting closer and closer. Mike went down first. 1 second he was right beside me. The next he was gone with a strangled yell. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We burst out of the tree line into the camp clearing, gasping for air. "Lock the cabins," I screamed. "Get everyone inside now." The next few hours were pure chaos. We could hear that thing circling the camp, growling and scratching at the cabin walls. The kids were terrified, and honestly, so were we. We tried calling for help, but the phones were dead, and there was no cell signal. Around 3 a.m., it got quiet. Too quiet. Dave volunteered to go check it out. We begged him not to, but he insisted. Said he was going to make a run for his truck and go for help. He made it about halfway across the grounds before it got him. One moment he was there, the next he was yanked into the air with a scream, disappearing into the darkness above the trees. We heard, God, the sounds, the crunching, the tearing. I'll never forget those sounds as long as I live. When dawn finally broke, the thing, Sam, the campers called it, was gone. But the nightmare was far from over. Rangers and police swarmed the camp. They found what was left of Mike and Dave in the woods. And Timmy, poor little Timmy, was never seen again. They shut down Camp Whispering Pines after that summer, said it was because of unsafe conditions or some bullshit. But those of us who were there, we know the truth. There's something evil in those woods, something old and hungry that's been preying on campers for who knows how long. I still have nightmares about that night, about Sam's face, those black eyes, that twisted grin. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that growl outside my window. I don't go camping anymore. Hell, I can barely stand to be in the woods at all, because I know what's out there, lurking in the shadows. And I know that someday, somehow, Sam's gonna come for me too, just like it came for Timmy and Mike and Dave. So if you're ever hiking or camping and you feel like something's watching you from the trees, if you hear a growl that doesn't sound quite right, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back, because Sam is real and it's always hungry for more. It all started on a routine patrol in early June. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm with a gentle breeze rustling through the pines. I was making my usual rounds, checking on campsites and keeping an eye out for any issues. Everything seemed normal at first, but as I hiked deeper into the backcountry, I started to notice something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, not even the sound of wind in the trees. It was as if someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling, telling myself it was probably just a weird atmospheric phenomenon. But as I continued my hike, the silence became oppressive. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. I whirled around, but there was nothing there, just trees and underbrush. I chalked it up to my imagination and headed back to the ranger station, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few weeks, things got progressively stranger. Other rangers started reporting similar experiences, unnatural silences, glimpses of something moving just out of sight. Campers complained about feeling uneasy, like they were being stalked by an unseen predator. We did our best to reassure everyone, but privately, we were all on edge. One night in late June, I was working a late shift, patrolling some of the more remote campsites. It was a moonless night, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. My flashlight barely penetrated the gloom. As I approached one of the sites, I heard a blood-curdling scream. I broke into a run, heart pounding. When I reached the campsite, I found it completely empty. No tent, no gear, nothing. It was as if the campers had vanished into thin air. I radioed for backup, and we conducted a thorough search, but found no trace of the missing campers. It was like they'd never even been there. We chalked it up to a prank call, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A few days later, I was hiking one of the more remote trails when I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing, I found a massive tree that had been violently uprooted. But it wasn't the fallen tree that terrified me. It was the claw marks. Deep gouges ran the length of the trunk, each one easily a foot long. Whatever had done this was huge and impossibly strong. I snapped some photos and hurried back to report what I'd found. My supervisor was skeptical, suggesting it might have been caused by a bear or maybe even vandals. But I knew better. No bear could have done that kind of damage, and the claw marks were far too high up for any human to reach. As July wore on, the incidents continued to escalate. More campers went missing, always from the most isolated sites. We found more trees with those terrifying claw marks, and the silence, that unnatural, oppressive silence, seemed to spread, engulfing larger and larger areas of the park. Then came the night that changed everything. I was on another late patrol, checking on a group of backcountry campers who hadn't checked in as scheduled. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver light over the landscape. As I approached their last known location, that familiar silence descended. Even the crunch of leaves under my boots seemed muffled. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And there, at the edge of the light, I saw it. A creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was tall, easily 8 feet, with impossibly long, spindly limbs. Its skin was a sickly grayish-white, almost translucent in the moonlight. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It had no features I could discern, just a smooth, blank expanse where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or even breathe. Then, with a speed that defied its gangly appearance, it lunged towards me. I stumbled backwards, tripping over a root and falling hard. As I scrambled to my feet, I caught another glimpse of it, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for its awkward frame. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail or my own safety. Branches whipped at my face, and I could hear it pursuing me, always just a few steps behind. The sound of its movement was wrong somehow, too fluid, too quiet for something so large. I don't know how long I ran or how I found my way back to the ranger station. By the time I burst through the door, I was gasping for breath, covered in scratches and bruises. My colleagues were alarmed, but when I tried to explain what I'd seen, the words wouldn't come. How could I describe something so utterly alien, so fundamentally wrong? In the days that followed, we mounted a massive search operation. We scoured every inch of that section of the park, but found no trace of the creature or the missing campers. The higher-ups tried to downplay the whole thing, suggesting I'd been spooked by a bear or maybe even suffered some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I know what I saw. And in the years since, I've come to believe that something ancient and malevolent has awakened in Whispering Pines. Something that doesn't belong in our world, that defies our understanding of nature and reality itself. I still work at the park, though I've requested transfers to more populated areas. I can't bring myself to venture into the deep backcountry anymore. The memory of that night, of that creature, is seared into my mind. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I swear I can hear something moving in the darkness beyond the tree line. Something watching, waiting. I don't know if it will ever reveal itself again or what its purpose might be. But I do know this. There are things in this world that we can't explain, forces beyond our comprehension. And sometimes, in the darkest corners of the wilderness, those forces make themselves known in terrifying ways. So if you ever find yourself in Whispering Pines National Park, stick to the well-traveled paths. Don't venture too deep into the backcountry. And if you ever feel that unnatural silence descend, if you ever catch a glimpse of something tall and wrong moving just at the edge of your vision, run. Run, and don't look back. Because there are some things in this world that were never meant to be seen by human eyes. It was October 1992, and I had just turned 44. I was feeling burnt out from my job as a paper company manager and decided I needed to get away from it all. A solo camping trip in the mountains seemed like the perfect escape. I'd always loved the outdoors, and the Pinolino Range was stunning that time of year with the fall colors. I packed up my gear and drove out to a remote trailhead, planning to spend a week hiking and camping in the backcountry. The first couple days were exactly what I needed: crisp autumn air, breathtaking views, and blissful solitude. I felt my stress melting away as I trekked through pine forests and alpine meadows. On the third day, things started to get strange. I was setting up camp for the evening when I noticed some odd tracks in the soft dirt near my tent. They looked vaguely like footprints, but elongated and misshapen. At first I thought they might be from a bear or mountain lion, but they didn't match any animal prints I'd ever seen. A chill ran down my spine as I studied them. They seemed almost human, but far too large and stretched out. I tried to shake off my unease, telling myself I was just letting my imagination run wild. But as night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. I kept seeing flashes of movement in my peripheral vision, only for there to be nothing there when I turned to look. I barely slept that night, lying awake in my tent, straining to hear any sounds of something prowling around outside. Just before dawn, I heard heavy footsteps circling my campsite. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to look outside, but I was paralyzed with fear. When morning finally came, I practically leapt out of my tent, half expecting to find myself surrounded. But the campsite looked undisturbed. I might have convinced myself it was all in my head, if not for a new set of those strange, elongated footprints pressed into the dirt just yards from where I'd slept. I should have hiked out right then and there, but some mixture of stubbornness, curiosity, and denial made me press on with my trip. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just some oddly shaped bear tracks, and my mind was playing tricks on me in the dark. How I wish I'd listened to my instincts, because that night is when I saw it for the first time. I was huddled by my campfire, trying to convince myself that the shadows dancing at the edge of the firelight were just trees swaying in the wind. Suddenly, I caught a flash of movement in the darkness beyond. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the trees. Two glowing eyes reflected back at me. They were set unnaturally high off the ground, at least 8 feet up. And they weren't the eyes of any animal I'd ever seen. They glowed with an eerie, almost otherworldly light. I caught a glimpse of a tall, gangling form before it melted back into the shadows. I was frozen in terror, my mind reeling as it tried to process what I'd just seen. It was like nothing that should exist in this world. My rational brain kept trying to come up with explanations. A bear standing on its hind legs, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by fear and isolation. But deep down, I knew I'd seen something beyond normal explanation. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my back pressed against a tree trunk, flashlight and hunting knife clutched in my trembling hands. By some miracle, I made it to morning without further incident. But any lingering doubts I had were erased when I found more of those twisted footprints all around my campsite. And some of the trees had deep claw marks gouged into the bark, higher up than any bear could reach. I'd like to say I immediately packed up and got the hell out of there, but a sort of morbid fascination had taken hold of me. I needed to understand what I was dealing with, so I decided to try and observe it from a safe distance. I spent that day hiking to a ridge overlooking a thickly forested valley. I set up a hidden observation post and settled in to watch as darkness fell. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just as my eyelids were getting heavy, I saw movement in the trees below. An impossibly tall, thin figure emerged from the forest. It moved with an unnatural, fluid grace on legs that seemed too long for its body. In the moonlight, I could make out grayish, leathery skin stretched tight over an emaciated frame. Its arms dangled almost to the ground, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. A noseless, lipless skull with sunken cheeks and those terrible glowing eyes. It swiveled its head back and forth, as if scanning for prey. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle-like teeth, and let out a keening wail that made my blood run cold. I must have made some small sound of terror, because suddenly those glowing eyes locked onto my position. I dove for cover, praying it hadn't seen me. I don't know how long I huddled there, scarcely daring to breathe. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out again, the creature was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I threw my gear in my pack and practically ran down the mountain. I've never moved so fast in my life, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting at any moment to see that nightmarish figure loping after me. Somehow, I made it back to my car without incident. I peeled out of that trailhead parking lot, my tires kicking up gravel. It wasn't until I was miles away on the highway that I finally let myself breathe. I've spent the decades since trying to make sense of what happened to me. I've pored over folklore and cryptozoology books, searched for similar encounters online, even gone back to those mountains a few times, though never alone and never staying after dark. I've heard whispered stories from locals about something they call the high tail that stalks the deep woods, but I've never found any definitive answers. Sometimes I manage to convince myself it was all just a vivid hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But then I'll wake up in a cold sweat, those glowing eyes seared into my mind, and I know with bone-deep certainty that what I saw was real. I don't know what that thing in the Pino Lino Mountains was. Some undiscovered creature? An alien? A demon? I only know that it opened my eyes to how little we truly understand about the world around us. There are things out there in the dark wilderness that defy explanation, things that shatter our comfortable illusions about reality. I haven't been the same since that trip. I find myself jumping at shadows, always feeling watched. I can't shake the feeling that one day I'll look out my window and see that tall, skeletal figure standing in my yard, those glowing eyes fixed on me. I pray I never encounter the high tail again, but part of me knows this isn't over. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting, watching, and I fear it's only a matter of time before our paths cross again. It was late afternoon when I arrived at the cabin after a long drive up winding mountain roads. The place was nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, with no other buildings in sight. Perfect, I thought. Just the isolation I was craving. I spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking my supplies and exploring the cozy interior of the rustic cabin. As night fell, I sat on the small porch with a cup of tea, listening to the chirping of crickets and admiring the blanket of stars overhead. The stillness was exactly what I needed after months of stress in the city. Around 11 p.m. I was getting ready for bed when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Peering out the window, I saw headlights approaching through the trees. My heart started racing. Who could possibly be coming here this late at night? The cabin was miles from anywhere, down an unmarked dirt road. The vehicle came to a stop about 50 yards from the cabin. 2 men got out, and even in the dim moonlight I could see they were carrying guns. Panic flooded through me as I realized this couldn't be anything good. I quickly turned off all the lights and crouched low, trying to stay out of sight. From my hiding spot, I could hear their muffled voices as they approached on foot. "Gotta be in there. Lights were just on," one of them was saying. I was trapped. There was no back door, and the windows were too small to climb through. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Suddenly there was a loud bang on the front door that made me jump. "Open up," a gruff voice shouted. "We know you're in there." My breath caught in my throat as I heard them trying to force the lock. In that moment of terror, survival instinct took over. I grabbed my phone and car keys, then silently made my way to a small closet in the bedroom. Just as I closed the closet door, I heard the front door burst open with a crash. Heavy footsteps entered the cabin. "Search the place," one of the men ordered. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they would hear it. I could barely breathe as I listened to them moving through the rooms, opening cabinets and overturning furniture. After what felt like an eternity, they entered the bedroom. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't check the closet. "Nobody here," one of them grunted. "Maybe they went for a walk or something." "Let's wait outside then," the other replied. "They gotta come back sometime." As their footsteps receded, I allowed myself to exhale, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. They were still out there, waiting. I had to find a way to escape. I waited about 15 minutes to make sure they were really gone, then slowly eased open the closet door. The cabin was a mess, but mercifully empty. Peering out the window, I could see the 2 men standing by their truck, passing a bottle back and forth. This was my chance. Heart in my throat, I crept to the front door and eased it open, wincing at every creak. The cool night air hit my face as I slipped outside, staying low and hugging the shadows. I made it to the tree line without being spotted, but now came the hard part. I had to make my way through pitch-black forest to reach the main road about 2 miles away, and I had to do it quickly and quietly before those men realized I was gone. Never in my life have I felt as vulnerable and exposed as I did stumbling through that dark forest. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle in the underbrush could have been a pursuer. I tripped and fell countless times, scraping my hands and knees, but terror kept me moving forward. After what felt like hours of blind fumbling, but was probably only 30 minutes, I heard shouting in the distance. They had discovered I was gone. New panic lent speed to my feet as I crashed recklessly through the brush, no longer caring about stealth. Branches whipped at my face and I could hear them gaining on me. My lungs were on fire and my legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to keep running. In my panic, I had lost all sense of direction. For all I knew, I was running deeper into the wilderness. Just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I caught a glimpse of light through the trees. A street lamp. With a final burst of desperate energy, I sprinted towards it. I burst out onto the road just as headlights appeared around a bend. Without thinking, I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The car screeched to a halt, and an older couple stared at me in shock. "Please," I gasped, "help me. There are men chasing me." They quickly ushered me into their car and sped off down the mountain. As we drove, I tried to explain what had happened between gulps of air. The couple exchanged worried glances, and the man said they would take me straight to the police station in town. At the station, I gave my statement to some very skeptical officers. They sent patrols up to the cabin, but of course found no sign of the men or their truck. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing in some kind of panic-induced hallucination. But the scratches on my arms and legs were proof enough that my ordeal had been real. To this day, I don't know who those men were or what they wanted. Were they burglars? Killers? Or was I just in the wrong place at the wrong time? I'll probably never know. But one thing's for certain. I'll never go to a secluded cabin alone again. The terror of that night will stay with me forever, a reminder of how quickly a peaceful retreat can turn into a nightmare. I was looking forward to a quiet weekend getaway at my family's old cabin in the mountains. It had been years since I'd visited, but with work stress piling up, I desperately needed some time alone to decompress. The cabin was remote, a good 30-minute drive from the nearest town down winding dirt roads, perfect for getting away from it all. As I pulled up the overgrown driveway that Friday evening, the sky was already darkening ominously. The weather forecast had mentioned potential storms, but I wasn't too worried. The cabin was sturdy, and I had plenty of supplies. I hurried to unload my car and get settled inside before the rain started. The first few hours were blissfully peaceful. I got a fire going in the old stone fireplace, heated up some soup for dinner, and curled up with a book as the wind picked up outside. Around 9 p.m., the storm hit in full force. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder boomed overhead, rattling the whole cabin. I've always loved a good thunderstorm, so I turned off the lights and watched nature's light show through the big picture window in the living room. That's when I saw it for the first time. A flash of lightning illuminated the yard, and for a split second I glimpsed a dark figure standing at the tree line, maybe 50 feet from the cabin. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart started racing. Had I really seen something, or was my mind playing tricks? I peered out into the darkness but could make out nothing in the gloom between lightning strikes. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or my eyes adjusting, but I couldn't quite convince myself. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as I double-checked that all the doors and windows were securely locked. For the next hour, I paced restlessly around the cabin, unable to relax. Every time lightning flashed, I found myself scanning the yard, half expecting to see that figure again. The rational part of my brain said I was being ridiculous. Who would be out there in this storm? But a primal fear had taken hold that I couldn't shake. Around 11 p.m., exhausted from the tension, I decided to try and get some sleep. I made my way to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. As I was changing into pajamas, a particularly bright flash of lightning lit up the room, and there in the window, a face, pale, gaunt, inhuman, staring right at me with dead black eyes. I screamed and stumbled backwards, crashing into the dresser. By the time I looked back, the face was gone. But I knew what I'd seen. Someone, or something, was out there, watching me. Panic took over. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course not. We were in the middle of nowhere. I was completely cut off. I ran back to the living room, grabbing the fireplace poker as a makeshift weapon. My eyes darted from window to window, straining to see anything in the flashes of lightning. For agonizing minutes, there was nothing. Then I saw it again, a dark silhouette, closer now, moving with unnatural speed between the trees. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed into a corner, poker clutched in shaking hands. Whatever was out there, it was toying with me, appearing for split seconds, then vanishing again, always getting closer. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I huddled there, jumping at every sound. The storm raged on, but now it felt like cover for something much more sinister. In my panicked state, my mind conjured all sorts of terrifying possibilities about what could be stalking me. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, during a brief lull in the storm, I heard it. Soft footsteps on the porch, the slow creak of floorboards. Something was right outside the door. I don't know what snapped in me at that moment, but suddenly staying in the cabin felt unbearable. I had to get out, had to run. Without really thinking it through, I bolted for the back door. I fumbled with the lock, threw the door open, and plunged out into the rain-soaked night. The wet leaves and branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I had no idea where I was going, just away from the cabin and whatever was hunting me. Lightning still flashed overhead, turning the forest into a strobe-lit nightmare. Every shadow seemed to move, every tree looked like a lurking figure. I ran until my lungs burned, slipping and sliding down muddy slopes. At some point I lost my shoes, but the adrenaline was so intense I barely noticed the rocks and thorns tearing at my feet. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. Behind me, I started to hear something, the snap of branches, rustling leaves, sounds that didn't match the rhythm of the storm. It was following me. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the stabbing pains in my side. In my blind panic, I lost all sense of direction. The trees all looked the same in the darkness. Was I going in circles? How far had I run? I had no idea, but I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast I went, the thing behind me was getting closer. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst out of the tree line onto a road. In the distance I could see lights, the outskirts of town. With a final burst of desperate energy, I sprinted towards civilization. As I staggered into the light of a gas station at the edge of town, I finally dared to look behind me. The road stretching back into the mountains was empty, no sign of pursuit. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, as the confused clerk came out to check on me. The police were called. I tried to explain what had happened, but even to my own ears it sounded insane. They sent a car out to the cabin but found nothing out of the ordinary, just some muddy footprints, mine, leading away from the back door. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. Was it all in my head, some kind of stress-induced breakdown? Or was there truly something evil lurking in those woods? I've never been back to the cabin to find out. But sometimes, when a storm rolls in, I find myself looking nervously out the window, half expecting to see that pale face staring back at me from the darkness. Having fun by yourself? I figured it was probably just one of my friends messing with me, so I texted back, "Who is this?" and went back to my phone. A few minutes later, another text came through. "Look out your window." That's when I started to feel a little uneasy. I got up and peeked through the curtains, but didn't see anyone outside. The street was dark and empty. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. I decided to ignore it and distract myself by watching some Netflix. But then my phone buzzed again. "I can see you on the couch. Nice pajamas." My heart started racing. How could they know what I was wearing? I jumped up and double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. As I was doing that, another message came through. "Don't bother. I'm already inside." I felt like I couldn't breathe. This had to be some kind of sick prank, right? But how did they know so much? I ran upstairs to my room and locked the door, my hands shaking as I tried to call my parents. No answer. The texts kept coming, getting more and more threatening. Come out, wherever you are. I'm getting closer. Found you!" I was in full panic mode now, huddled in the corner of my room, clutching a baseball bat. Every little creak of the house made me jump. I tried texting some friends for help, but no one was responding. Suddenly, the power went out and I was plunged into darkness. My phone's flashlight was the only source of light. I could hear footsteps coming up the stairs, slow and deliberate. My whole body was trembling. The doorknob to my room started to turn. I held my breath, gripping the bat tightly. But the door was locked. They couldn't get in. I heard a low chuckle from the other side. "Open the door. I just want to talk." The voice was muffled but sounded disturbingly familiar. I stayed absolutely still, too terrified to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated back down the hall. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peek out into the hallway. It was empty. I crept downstairs, bat in hand, checking every room. No sign of anyone. Just as I was starting to think maybe I had imagined it all, I saw movement outside the living room window. A dark figure was standing in the yard, staring directly at me. I screamed and ran out the front door, not even bothering to grab shoes or a jacket. I sprinted to my neighbor's house and pounded on the door until they answered. Through sobs, I tried to explain what happened. They called the police, who came and searched the house but found no evidence of an intruder. It's been 2 weeks, and I still have no idea who was behind those messages or if the figure I saw was real. The police traced the number, but it was a burner phone that led nowhere. My parents installed a security system, but I still don't feel safe in my own home. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering if there was something I missed. Could it have been someone I know? A hacker who got into my devices? Or something even more sinister? The worst part is not knowing. Every time my phone buzzes now, I feel a jolt of fear. I'm jumpy and paranoid all the time. My parents are talking about therapy, but I don't know if that will help. How can I feel safe when I don't even know what I'm afraid of? I know this sounds crazy, and part of me still hopes it was all just an elaborate prank. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was in my house that night is still out there, watching, waiting, and I have no idea when they might come back. Sometimes at night, I swear I can still hear those footsteps coming up the stairs. I've taken to sleeping with the lights on and my baseball bat next to the bed. My friends think I'm overreacting, but they weren't there. They didn't feel that overwhelming sense of violation and helplessness. I've gone over every detail of that night 1,000 times in my head. Was there something I could have done differently? Should I have called the police right away? But I was so sure at first that it was just a friend messing with me. By the time I realized how serious it was, I was too paralyzed with fear to think straight. The police said there were no signs of forced entry, which makes it even creepier. How did they get in? Or were they never actually inside at all? Maybe they just had cameras or bugs planted in the house somehow. But that almost seems worse. The idea that someone could have been watching me for who knows how long without me realizing it. I've become hyper-aware of every little thing now. I constantly check to make sure doors and windows are locked. I've covered up all the cameras on my devices with tape. I deleted all my social media accounts. But it still doesn't feel like enough. The other day, I got a text from another unknown number that just said, "Miss me?" I nearly had a panic attack right there in the middle of class. It turned out to be a wrong number, but it took me hours to calm down. My parents are worried sick about me. They keep saying I need to try to move on and not let this control my life. But how can I when I still have no answers? How am I supposed to just go back to normal when I know there's someone out there who has it out for me? I've started doing research online, trying to find similar cases or any information that might help explain what happened. But that's just led me down a rabbit hole of creepy stories that make it even harder to sleep at night. Some days I almost convince myself that I imagined the whole thing, that maybe I fell asleep watching a scary movie and it all got mixed up in my head. But then I remember the pure terror I felt, the sound of those footsteps, the sight of that figure in the yard, and I know it was real. I'm writing this all out partly in hopes that someone might have some insight or advice, but also because I'm terrified of forgetting any detail in case it turns out to be important later. And I guess part of me hopes that by sharing my story, I might feel less alone in this nightmare. To whoever's reading this, please, be careful. Don't ever assume you're safe just because you're in your own home. You never know who might be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I used to think things like this only happened in movies or to other people. Now I know better, and I'll never feel truly safe again. That's when I noticed it, a faint flickering coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. At first, I thought maybe it was just headlights from a passing car, but the pattern seemed too erratic. I sat up slowly, straining my eyes to see better in the darkness. The flickering continued, casting eerie shadows that danced across my bedroom walls. A chill ran down my spine. Something about this didn't feel right at all. Hesitantly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. Part of me wanted to just hide under the covers and wait for morning, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I figured out what was causing those strange lights. I crept towards my bedroom door, wincing at every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. As I got closer, I could see that the flickering was coming from the overhead hallway light. It was rapidly blinking on and off, creating a disorienting strobe effect. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the doorknob. Taking a deep breath to steel my nerves, I slowly opened the door and peered out into the hall. The flickering was even more intense up close. I blinked rapidly, my eyes struggling to adjust. That's when I saw it, a dark figure at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the split-second flashes of light. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The figure was unnaturally tall and thin, its proportions all wrong, and it seemed to be staring directly at me. In a panic, I slammed the door shut and fumbled for my phone on the nightstand. With trembling fingers, I tried to dial 911, but in my haste, I kept mistyping the numbers. After what felt like an eternity, I finally got the call to go through. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. There's someone in my apartment, I whispered urgently. Please, you have to send help right away. Sir, I need you to take a deep breath and tell me your address, the operator replied. I rattled off my address and apartment number, then added, Please hurry. I don't know if they're still out there. Officers are on their way. Can you tell me more about what you saw? I described the flickering lights and the strange figure I'd glimpsed. Even as I was explaining, a part of me wondered if I had imagined it all. It seemed so surreal. Stay on the line with me until the officers arrive, the operator instructed. Are you in a safe place? I'm in my bedroom, I replied. I shut the door, but I don't know if it's locked. If you can safely do so, lock the door and stay where you are. Do not confront the intruder. I crept back to the door and turned the lock as quietly as I could. Then I retreated to the far corner of the room, phone clutched tightly to my ear. The minutes crawled by agonizingly slowly as I waited for help to arrive. I strained my ears for any sounds from the hallway, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and pounding heartbeat. Suddenly, a loud knock at my front door made me jump. Police! Open up! A voice called out. Relief flooded through me. They're here, I told the 911 operator. All right, you can hang up now. Stay safe, sir. I cautiously made my way to the front door, peering through the peephole to confirm it was indeed the police before opening it. 2 officers stood in the hallway, looking alert but calm. We got a call about a possible intruder, one of them said. Are you all right, sir? I nodded, still shaken. I'm okay, but I saw someone, or something, in the hallway earlier, and the lights were flickering really strangely. The officers exchanged a glance. Mind if we take a look around? Please do, I replied, stepping aside to let them in. They did a thorough sweep of my apartment, checking every room, closet, and possible hiding place. I followed behind at a distance, my nerves still on edge. We didn't find any signs of forced entry or anyone else in the apartment, one officer reported after they'd finished. As for the lights, they seem to be working normally now. Maybe there was a power surge earlier? I frowned, confused. The hallway light was indeed working perfectly now, casting a steady glow with no hint of flickering. But I know what I saw, I protested weakly. There was definitely someone or something out there. The officers looked skeptical, but tried to be reassuring. Sometimes our eyes can play tricks on us in the dark, one of them said gently, especially if we're startled awake. But we'll file a report and have patrols keep an eye on the area, just in case. They left me with a card to call if I noticed anything else suspicious. As I locked the door behind them, I couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't really believe me. Hell, I was starting to doubt myself at this point. But as I turned to head back to bed, movement caught the corner of my eye. I whirled around, heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there, just shadows cast by the kitchen counter. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I was obviously overtired and letting my imagination run wild. The smart thing to do would be to go back to bed and try to get some sleep. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. Instead, I grabbed a blanket and curled up on the couch, leaving every light in the apartment blazing. I knew I was being irrational, but I couldn't shake the creeping dread that had settled over me. Every tiny sound made me flinch: the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the occasional car passing on the street below. My eyes kept darting to the shadows in the corners of the room, half expecting to see that impossible figure materialize again. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows. I blinked groggily, my neck stiff from sleeping awkwardly on the couch. For a moment I was disoriented, wondering why I wasn't in my bed. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back. In the warm light of day, it all seemed so absurd. Surely I had just had a particularly vivid nightmare, right? I got up and walked to the hallway, half expecting to see scuff marks or some other sign of the previous night's disturbance. But everything looked completely normal. I shook my head, feeling a bit foolish now. What a way to lose a night's sleep over nothing. I resolved to cut back on late-night horror movies and headed to the kitchen to make some much-needed coffee. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I scrolled through my phone, noticing a missed call from an unknown number. Curious, I played the voicemail. "Hello, sir. This is Officer Chen following up on last night's incident," a familiar voice said. "I wanted to let you know that we did a check of the building's security cameras, and there's something you should see. Please give me a call back at your earliest convenience." I froze, the phone nearly slipping from my suddenly numb fingers. The security cameras. I hadn't even thought about those. With shaking hands, I dialed the number. As it rang, my mind raced with possibilities. Had they actually caught something on camera, or was this just a courtesy follow-up? "Officer Chen," the voice answered on the third ring. "This is John from apartment 4B, I said, my voice sounding strangely calm to my own ears. "You left me a message about the security footage?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Officer Chen spoke again, his voice was oddly hesitant. "Yes, Mr. Stevens. We reviewed the hallway camera feeds from last night. There's something you need to see for yourself. Can you come down to the station this afternoon?" A chill ran down my spine. "What is it? What did you see?" Another pause. "I'd really rather not discuss it over the phone, sir. Please just come to the station and we can go over the footage together." I agreed, my mind whirling. As I hung up, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, just like the night before. I spun around, heart pounding. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a tall, impossibly thin figure standing in the corner of my living room. But when I blinked, it was gone. I stood there frozen, the forgotten coffee maker gurgling in the background. Slowly, I turned in a circle, scrutinizing every shadow and corner of the room. There was nothing there, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. What had the camera captured? And more importantly, was I really alone in this apartment? As I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, determined to get to the bottom of this, one thought kept echoing through my mind. What if the nightmare wasn't over? What if it was only just beginning? I recently moved to a rural farmhouse with my 12-year-old daughter Emma. We were excited for a fresh start away from the chaos of the city. The old house needed some work, but it had a certain charm that drew us in. Little did I know that our peaceful new life was about to be shattered. It was a chilly autumn evening, about a month after we'd settled in. Emma was working on homework in the living room while I prepared dinner in the kitchen. The house creaked and groaned as old houses tend to do. But suddenly, I heard a distinct thump from upstairs that made me pause. I called out to Emma, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what, Dad?" she replied, not looking up from her textbook. I shrugged it off and went back to chopping vegetables. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, a dull thud, followed by what sounded like scratching. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the attic. "Emma, I think there might be an animal in the attic," I said. "I'm going to go check it out." She looked up, a hint of worry in her eyes. I hesitated. Part of me wanted her to stay safely downstairs, but another part didn't want to leave her alone. "Sure, come on, we'll investigate together." We climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, and I pulled down the creaky attic ladder. The musty smell of old wood and dust hit us as we ascended into the dimly lit space. I flicked on my flashlight, illuminating piles of forgotten junk left by the previous owners. As we moved deeper into the attic, the scratching sound grew louder. It seemed to be coming from behind an old wardrobe pushed against the far wall. Emma clung to my arm as we approached. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, feeling silly talking to what was probably just a raccoon or squirrel. But there was no response, just more scratching. I carefully slid the heavy wardrobe to the side, revealing a section of wall that looked different from the rest. The wooden planks were newer, as if covering up something. My heart began to race as I ran my hand along the boards. One of them felt loose. I pried it away, revealing a gaping black hole behind it about 2 feet in diameter. A gust of stale air rushed out, making us both recoil. "What is that, Dad?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. I shone my flashlight into the opening. Broken bricks and cobwebs partially obscured my view, but I could make out what looked like a passageway extending back into darkness. I'm not sure," I stammered. "It looks like some kind of hidden room or tunnel." Just then, we heard another thud from inside the hole, followed by more frantic scratching. It sounded much closer now. Emma let out a small scream, and I quickly pulled her back. It's okay," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "Let's go back downstairs and I'll call someone to come check this out." But as we turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. There on the dusty attic floor were several distinct muddy footprints. They led from the hole in the wall to the attic entrance, as if something had come out of that passageway and left the attic. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were our own footprints and I just hadn't noticed before. But no, these prints were much larger than either of ours, and the mud was still wet. "Emma, go downstairs right now," I said urgently. "Go to the car and lock the doors. I'll be right behind you." She didn't need to be told twice. She bolted down the attic ladder as I took one last look around, my hands shaking as I held the flashlight. The scratching in the wall had stopped. An eerie silence fell over the attic. I hurried after Emma, slamming the attic door behind me. As I rushed down the hall, I noticed more muddy prints on the hardwood floor leading towards the stairs. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. I found Emma huddled in the car, tears streaming down her face. I jumped in and locked the doors, fumbling with my keys as I started the engine. "What's happening, Dad?" she sobbed. "What was in there?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice calm as I backed out of the driveway. "But we're going to be okay. We're leaving now." As we sped down the dark country road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see some monstrous figure chasing after us. But there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out behind us. We drove for hours, eventually checking into a motel in the next town over. I called the police and reported what we'd found, but I could tell from their tone that they didn't take it too seriously. They said they'd send someone out to check the property in the morning. Emma and I barely slept that night. Every little sound made us jump. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. That hole in the wall, where did it lead? And those footprints. I couldn't shake the image of some creature emerging from that dark passageway and stalking through our home. The next day, we reluctantly returned to the house with a police officer. But when we went up to the attic, everything looked normal. The wardrobe was back in place. There was no hole in the wall, no muddy footprints. The officer clearly thought we were crazy or playing some kind of prank. But I know what we saw. Emma knows too. We moved out that same day, leaving most of our belongings behind. I couldn't bear the thought of spending another night in that house. It's been months now, and we've settled in a new place closer to the city. But I still have nightmares about that attic. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear scratching coming from inside the walls. Emma refuses to sleep alone now. She says she's afraid something will come out of her closet in the middle of the night. I want to tell her that monsters aren't real, that there's nothing to be afraid of. But after what we experienced in that farmhouse, I'm not so sure anymore. I've done some research, trying to find any history of the property that might explain what we encountered. But I've come up empty. It's as if that hidden passageway never existed. Part of me wants to go back, to prove to myself that it was all just a product of our imagination. But a bigger part of me is terrified of what I might find if I do. What if that thing is still there, waiting in the darkness? I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. All I know is that our lives were forever changed by what we discovered in that attic. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened. Because once you've glimpsed what lies beyond, you can never truly feel safe again. I was exhausted after a long day at my new job when I heard a frantic knocking at my apartment door. Confused and a bit annoyed, I reluctantly got up from the couch to see who it was. Through the peephole, I saw my neighbor Dave looking panicked. "Hey man, I'm so sorry to bother you this late, but I really need your help," he called out. "It's an emergency." I hesitated for a moment. I didn't know Dave very well. We'd only exchanged brief hellos in the hallway since I moved in a few weeks ago. But he seemed genuinely distressed, so I opened the door. "What's going on?" I asked, stifling a yawn. Dave was breathing heavily, his eyes wild. "It's my grandmother. She fell and I can't get her up. I need help lifting her. Please, can you come over for just a minute?" I nodded, grabbing my keys. "Of course, lead the way." As we walked down the hall to his apartment, Dave kept rambling nervously about how his grandmother had been staying with him and must have slipped getting out of bed. I felt a twinge of sympathy. It sounded like a scary situation. Dave fumbled with his keys for a moment before opening his door. As soon as we stepped inside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off. The apartment was eerily quiet and dark. There was no sign of anyone else there, let alone an elderly woman who had fallen. "Where's your grandmother?" I asked hesitantly. Dave's demeanor shifted instantly. A sinister grin spread across his face as he locked the door behind us. "Oh, she's not here," he said in a low voice. "But you are." My heart began to race as I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. I turned to bolt, but Dave was faster. He lunged at me, tackling me to the floor. We struggled violently as I tried to fight him off. Dave was much stronger than he looked. His eyes were crazed as he attempted to pin me down. "I've been watching you," he snarled. "Pretty boy living all alone." You should be more careful who you trust." Adrenaline surged through me as I fought with everything I had. This couldn't be happening. How could I have been so naive? I managed to knee Dave hard in the stomach, momentarily stunning him. Using the opportunity, I scrambled to my feet and ran for the door. But it was locked, and in my panicked state, I couldn't figure out how to open it. Dave recovered quickly and charged at me again. This time I was ready. I grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at his head with all my strength. It connected with a sickening crack, and Dave crumpled to the floor. Breathing heavily, I stared at his motionless form for a moment. Was he dead? I didn't stick around to find out. With shaking hands, I finally got the door unlocked and fled into the hallway. I ran down the stairs and out of the building, not stopping until I was a block away. Only then did I lean against a wall, gasping for air as the reality of what just happened sunk in. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911. As I waited for the police to arrive, waves of shock and disbelief washed over me. How could this have happened? I'd always thought I was a good judge of character. Dave had seemed so normal, so friendly. When the police got there, I gave them a statement and they went to investigate Dave's apartment. To my horror, they discovered that he had a history of assault and had recently been released from prison. Apparently, I wasn't his first intended victim. The next few days passed in a blur. I gave more statements to detectives, started looking for a new apartment, and tried to process the trauma of what had happened. I couldn't sleep, jumping at every little sound. The what-ifs kept running through my mind. What if I hadn't been able to fight Dave off? What would he have done to me? I kept replaying every interaction I'd had with Dave since moving in, trying to see if there were warning signs I'd missed. But there was nothing. He'd seemed completely ordinary. The scariest part was realizing that true danger can lurk behind a friendly facade. As the shock wore off, it was replaced by a deep sense of violated trust. I'd always tried to see the best in people, to be kind and helpful. But this experience shattered my faith in humanity. How could I ever feel safe around strangers again? My family urged me to move back home for a while, but I was determined to stay. I didn't want to let fear control my life, but I did take steps to increase my security, changing the locks, installing cameras, taking self-defense classes. Slowly, I started to feel a bit safer, but I knew I would never be the same carefree, trusting person I was before. The world suddenly seemed much darker and more dangerous. Weeks passed, and life began to return to some semblance of normality. I threw myself into work, trying to stay busy and not dwell on what had happened. But I still had nightmares about Dave's crazed eyes and grasping hands. One day, about a month after the incident, I ran into my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, in the hallway. She smiled warmly and asked how I was settling in. "I'm doing all right," I replied with a forced smile. "Still adjusting, I guess." She nodded sympathetically. "Well, don't be a stranger, dear. Us neighbors need to look out for each other." I felt a chill run down my spine at her words. That's exactly what I'd thought I was doing when I agreed to help Dave. I mumbled a quick goodbye and hurried into my apartment, double-checking that the door was locked behind me. As I leaned against the door, trying to calm my racing heart, I realized that the trauma ran deeper than I'd thought. Even an innocuous interaction with a sweet old lady now filled me with fear and suspicion. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by a fresh wave of anger and grief. Anger at Dave for what he'd done, and grief for the loss of my innocence and trust in others. Would I ever feel truly safe again? Would I ever be able to open my door without fear? That night, I lay awake for hours, listening to every creak and groan of the building. I kept imagining footsteps in the hallway, someone trying my doorknob. Logically, I knew Dave was in jail and couldn't hurt me. But logic didn't help much in the dark of night. As weeks turned to months, the acute fear began to fade, but it was replaced by a constant low-level anxiety, always simmering beneath the surface. I was hyper-vigilant everywhere I went, assessing potential threats and planning escape routes. I still couldn't bring myself to be friendly with neighbors or strike up conversations with strangers. The open, trusting part of me felt like it had died that night in Dave's apartment. Sometimes I wondered if I was overreacting, if I should just get over it already. But then I'd remember the sheer terror of realizing I was trapped with a madman, and I knew my caution was justified. 1 year after the incident, I finally felt ready to move to a new apartment across town. As I packed up my things, I reflected on how much my life had changed. I was more guarded now, more cynical, but I was also stronger and more self-reliant. I'd learned the hard way that evil can hide behind a friendly smile. But I'd also learned that I was capable of fighting back, of surviving. I would carry the scars of that night with me forever, but I was determined not to let fear rule my life. As I closed the door on my old apartment for the last time, I took a deep breath. A new chapter was beginning, one where I was wiser, warier, but still moving forward. I would probably never fully trust strangers again, but I could trust in my own strength and resilience, and for now, that was enough. I was never the type to believe in ghost stories or supernatural occurrences. As a rational person, I always sought logical explanations for seemingly unexplainable events. But what happened to me last month has shaken my beliefs to the core, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. It all started on a quiet Tuesday evening. My husband James had left for a 2-week business trip that morning, and I was settling into my first night alone in our new house. We had only moved in a month ago, so I was still getting used to all the creaks and sounds of the unfamiliar space. As I curled up on the couch with a glass of wine and my favorite true crime podcast, I heard a soft thud from upstairs. My heart rate instantly spiked, but I tried to calm myself. It was probably just the house settling, I reasoned. Still, I turned down the volume on my phone and listened intently for any other noises. A few minutes passed in tense silence before I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. I had just taken another sip of wine when my phone buzzed with a text notification. Grateful for the distraction, I opened the message, expecting it to be James checking in. Instead, my blood ran cold as I stared at the screen in disbelief. It was a photo of me, sitting on the very couch I was on at that moment, glass of wine in hand. The angle was from above, as if someone was looking down from the second-floor landing. My hands shaking, I jumped up and spun around, searching for any sign of an intruder. But the house was silent and still. I ran to check all the doors and windows, finding them securely locked. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had someone hacked my phone's camera? But the angle was all wrong for that. Just as I was about to call the police, another text came through. This one showed me in the kitchen earlier that evening, chopping vegetables for dinner. My stomach churned as I realized someone had been watching me for hours without my knowledge. Panic fully set in as I frantically dialed 911. While I waited for the police to arrive, 2 more photos came through in quick succession. One of me in the shower that morning and another of me sleeping in bed the night before. I felt violated, exposed, and utterly terrified. The police arrived within minutes, but their thorough search of the house and property turned up nothing. No signs of forced entry, No hidden cameras, nothing out of place. They took my statement and copies of the photos, promising to investigate further. But I could tell by their expressions that they were as baffled as I was. That night, I stayed with a friend, too scared to be alone in the house. But even surrounded by people, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those haunting images of myself, oblivious to the predatory gaze capturing my most private moments. The next day, I returned home with my friend, determined to find some explanation. We scoured every inch of the house, looking for hidden cameras or any sign of how someone could have taken those photos. But we found nothing. As the days passed, the photos kept coming, always from impossible angles, always showing me in moments when I thought I was completely alone. I changed my phone number, but somehow they still found me. I covered every window, but they still seemed to see inside. The police were stumped. They installed security cameras around the property, but the mysterious photographer was never caught on film. It was as if they could move through walls, invisible to everyone but me. My mental state deteriorated rapidly. I couldn't sleep, jumping at every sound and shadow. I lost weight, unable to eat as the constant stress gnawed at my insides. My friends and family were worried sick, but there was little they could do to help. James called every day, distraught at what was happening, but unable to return early from his critical business meetings. I could hear the guilt in his voice, wishing he could be there to protect me. But part of me was glad he wasn't there to see me falling apart. After a week of this psychological torture, I was at my breaking point. That's when things took an even stranger turn. The photo I received that night wasn't of me, but of James in his hotel room. He was sleeping, the image taken from above his bed. Confused and frightened, I immediately called James. He answered groggily, having just woken up. When I described the photo, he became fully alert, fear evident in his voice. He hadn't received any strange photos himself, but the idea that whoever was stalking me had now found him was terrifying. The next day, the photos alternated between James and me. Him in meetings, me at the grocery store. Him having dinner alone, me visiting my parents. It was clear that whoever was behind this had an impossible reach. As the end of James's trip approached, the frequency of the photos increased. By the night before his return, I was receiving a new image every hour, like a countdown. The final photo came just as I heard James's key in the lock. It showed him standing outside our front door, hand raised to open it. I practically fell into his arms when he entered, sobbing with relief and residual fear. James held me tight, murmuring comforting words and promises of protection. But as I looked up into his face, I noticed something odd in his eyes, a flicker of satisfaction. Before I could process that unsettling observation, James's expression changed to one of confusion. He pulled out his phone, showing me a text he had just received. It was a photo of us, embracing in the entryway, taken from the stairs behind me. We both whirled around, but of course there was no one there. James immediately called the police while I sank to the floor, my mind unable to cope with this new development. How could the photos still be coming when James was here with me? The next few hours passed in a blur of police questions and fruitless searches. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion hit me like a truck. James practically carried me up to bed, promising to keep watch while I slept. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke to the sound of a camera shutter. My eyes flew open to see James standing over me, phone in hand, a strange smile on his face. In that moment, all the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "It was you," I whispered, my voice hoarse with disbelief and betrayal. "All this time, it was you." James's smile faltered, replaced by a look of desperation. "I had to," he said, his voice pleading. "I needed to feel close to you, to be part of your life even when I wasn't here. Don't you see? This way, I never have to leave you alone." As he spoke, I noticed other phones set up around the room, all aimed at the bed. The full extent of his deception and violation hit me like a physical blow. This man I had loved and trusted had systematically terrorized me for weeks, all for his own twisted sense of connection. I learned later that James had been struggling with severe anxiety and abandonment issues, exacerbated by the stress of his job and our recent move. In his deteriorating mental state, he had convinced himself that this elaborate scheme was a way to stay connected to me, to never truly be apart. He had set up a complex system of hidden cameras throughout our house and hacked into security systems everywhere I went. The photos from his business trip were taken by a private investigator he had hired to follow him, all to maintain the illusion. The aftermath of this revelation was devastating. James was arrested and diagnosed with several mental health issues. Our marriage, of course, was over. I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered sense of security and trust. It's been months now, and I'm still struggling to process everything that happened. I've moved to a new city, started therapy, and am slowly rebuilding my life. But the scars of those weeks of terror run deep. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, never fully at ease. The rational part of my brain understands that James is getting the help he needs and can no longer hurt me. But in the dark of night, when I hear an unexpected sound or catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, I'm right back in that house, feeling exposed and hunted. I share this story not to frighten, but as a cautionary tale. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And remember that sometimes the monsters we fear aren't supernatural beings or strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they're the people closest to us, hiding behind a mask of love,